Colton Briggs leaned back in his chair at the center of the Rusty Spur saloon, surrounded by the men who had spent years telling him he was the best thing Redstone Crossing had ever produced, and he let the whiskey sit untouched in front of him while he said what he'd come to say. "She's going to marry me." He didn't lower his voice. He didn't need to. "The Ashcroft girl. I've already decided." Across the room, old Pete Garner set down his glass. "You've decided." "That's what I said." "She know about this decision of yours?" Colton smiled the way a man smiles when he thinks the answer is so obvious it barely deserves a reply. "She will." Nobody laughed. Nobody pushed back. Because in Redstone Crossing, Texas, in the autumn of 1887, Colton Briggs didn't make threats. He made announcements. And announcements from men who owned 12,000 acres of cattle country and wore their confidence like a second skin had a way of becoming facts before anyone thought to argue otherwise. If you've ever watched someone claim another person like they were property left out in the open, hit that like button right now, because this story is going to take you somewhere those men never expected. Drop your city and country in the comments so I can see how far this tale has traveled, and follow the channel so you don't miss what happens when a woman with a railroad fortune decides for herself who deserves her heart. The morning Vivian Ashcroft arrived in Redstone Crossing, the sky was the particular shade of gray that comes just before the Texas sun burns through everything and makes the day feel borrowed. She stepped down from the carriage before the driver had properly stopped, which was something she'd done since she was 7 years old, and which her late father's business partners had always described as impatience, and which she thought of simply as not seeing the point of waiting when the ground was already there. The town was smaller than the map suggested. Main Street ran about 4 blocks before it gave up and turned into open scrubland, and the buildings on either side had the look of structures that had survived several things they hadn't been built to survive. A dry goods store, a livery, a telegraph office with a cracked window someone had patched with brown paper, a saloon that was already busy at 10 in the morning, which told her something about the local relationship with time. She had come for the land survey. Her father's estate had held a significant interest in a planned rail spur running through this part of the county, and the lawyers in San Antonio had been sending contradictory reports for 3 months about what exactly the Ashcroft holdings included and what they didn't. Vivian had learned early that contradictory reports from lawyers usually meant someone was doing something they hoped she wouldn't look at too closely. So she looked. Her assistant, a thin and perpetually nervous man named Mr. Holt, climbed down behind her and immediately began consulting the leather folio he carried everywhere. "The land office is 2 blocks north," he said. "The surveyor's name is Alderman. He's expecting us at 11. "Good." She looked up and down the street. "What else is here?" Holt blinked. "I'm sorry?" "In the town. What is there?" "Well," he consulted the folio as though it might contain this information. "A general store, 2 churches, a blacksmith, several. I'll walk." "Miss Ashcroft, the meeting is at 11. It is currently 10:15. She handed him her traveling bag. "Walk with me or don't." He walked with her. She had been in frontier towns before, though not many. Her world was mostly the railroad offices in Houston and Dallas, the hotels in San Antonio, the inherited house in Austin that she'd lived in alone since her father died 2 years ago. The frontier was something she understood mostly through account books, which described it in terms of land value and mineral rights and easements, which was a language she was fluent in but which had very little to say about what a place actually felt like. Redstone Crossing felt, she decided, like a town that worked hard and didn't expect applause for it. The blacksmith shop sat near the end of the main street, and she would not have noticed it at all, except that a woman was standing outside it crying, and Vivian Ashcroft had never been able to walk past a crying woman without stopping. It wasn't sentiment exactly. It was more that crying women, in her experience, were usually right about whatever had caused the crying. The woman was perhaps 60, with the kind of face that had spent decades in weather. She was holding a broken piece of farm equipment, a harrow tine, Vivian thought, though she wasn't entirely sure, and she was crying quietly, the way people cry when they've decided crying is the only option left but they're embarrassed about it. "What's happened?" Vivian asked. The woman looked up. She took in Vivian's clothes, which were Austin clothes and therefore wrong for this street, and she seemed to decide that the question was genuine despite the dress. "It's nothing," she said, which was what people said when it was something. It doesn't look like nothing. The woman glanced at the broken piece of metal in her hands. My husband passed in March. I've been trying to manage the farm myself. The harrow broke yesterday, and without it I can't work the soil before the freeze comes, and if I can't work the soil— She stopped. The man inside says he can't fix it. Why not? He says the metal's too old. The whole piece needs to be replaced, and the replacement costs $14 and I don't have $14. Vivian looked at the shop. Through the open door she could see the orange glow of a forge and the shape of a man working at something she couldn't quite make out. She could hear the rhythm of a hammer, regular, patient, not hurried. "Wait here," she said. Holt made a sound behind her. She ignored it. The inside of the shop was hot in the way that took a moment to adjust to, the heat coming up from the forge in waves that she could feel on her face before her eyes had sorted out the details of the room. It was bigger than it looked from outside. The walls were hung with tools and arrangements that seemed chaotic, but probably weren't. There were pieces of metal in various stages of completion on a heavy wooden bench along one wall, and horseshoes stacked in rows near the door, and coils of chain hanging from hooks in the ceiling. The man at the forge had his back to her. He was working a piece of iron with a hammer and tongs, turning it against the anvil with the kind of automatic precision that meant he'd done this particular motion so many times, his hands had memorized it separately from his brain. He was younger than she expected, late 20s, she guessed, though she could only see the back of him. "Excuse me," she said. He held up one finger, not rudely, just the gesture of a man who was at a point in something where stopping would mean starting over, and finished one more strike against the iron before setting the hammer down and turning. He had a plain face, not unpleasant, just plain, the kind of face that didn't announce itself. Brown hair pushed back from his forehead, dark eyes that were currently evaluating her with the practiced look of someone trying to figure out what kind of problem had just walked in. "Help you?" he said. "The woman outside, the harrowtine." "I told her already, the metal's too far gone to patch. She needs a new piece." "How much would it cost you to make one?" He looked at her steadily. $3 in iron, 4 hours of work. "And you quoted her 14. Something shifted in his expression, not guilt exactly, more like recalibration. "The piece has to be custom fitted to her equipment. It's not a standard size. The extra cost is— "The extra cost," Vivian said, "is $10 more than it costs you, which is how business works. And I understand that. But that woman's husband died in March, and she's trying to keep her farm through the winter, and she's standing outside your shop crying." He was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. It came out differently than she expected. Not defensive, just honest. Weighted with something she couldn't immediately name. "Then why?" "Because I've already fixed things for her twice this year for free, and the Hendersons before the harvest, and the Morales family's well pump in July." He picked up a rag and wiped his hands with it, not breaking eye contact. "I'm not made of iron, Miss Ashcroft." Something moved across his face. Recognition, she thought. The name had that effect in most parts of Texas. "Miss Ashcroft." He said it without the usual shift in tone that her name produced in people, the slight increase in deference, the recalculation of who they were talking to. He just said it like he was noting a fact. "I've got rent on this shop, and I've got iron to buy, and I've got a forge that eats coal like it's got somewhere to be. I can't give everything away and stay open." "I'm not asking you to give it away." She reached into the small purse she carried and put $14 on the wooden bench between them. "I'm paying the full amount. You do the job at a price she can manage." He looked at the money, then at her. "Why?" "Because I can, and she can't." She said it simply, without the discomfort that usually came with the statement of a financial advantage. It was just a fact. And because she shouldn't have to lose her farm because of a piece of iron. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might refuse. Then he picked up $11 from the bench and put 3 of them back in front of her. "I'll charge her 3, he said. "That's what it cost me. You can have your change. Keep it." "I don't need—" "Keep it," she said again. "Put it toward the next person who can't afford what they need." He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then he nodded once, the way people nod when they've decided something and aren't going to make a production out of it. I'm Gideon Hale, he said. I know. She didn't actually, but she thought it would be useful to seem like she did. She was almost out the door when he spoke again. The lantern. She turned. He was looking at the small brass travel lantern hooked to her bag. She'd forgotten it was there, had been carrying it for a week since the mechanism that controlled the wick had jammed, and she hadn't found anyone who could fix it. It's broken, she said. I can see that. He held out his hand. She unhooked it and gave it to him. He turned it over once, twice, pressed his thumb against the mechanism, tilted it toward the forge light. 40 seconds passed. There's a crack in the housing that's putting pressure on the feed wheel, he said. Whoever tried to fix this last made it worse. I can have it done by tomorrow morning. I'm meeting with the land surveyor today. I said tomorrow morning. She almost smiled. All right. She walked back out into the gray morning light, and the woman was still standing there, still holding the broken harrow tine, and Vivian told her that the problem was being handled, and the woman's face did something complicated and grateful that Vivian hadn't prepared herself for. Behind her, through the walls of the shop, she could hear the hammer start up again. She did not look back. The meeting with Alderman, the surveyor, lasted 3 hours and confirmed what she had suspected. 2 of the 4 parcels her father had held interest in had been quietly reclassified in the county records 18 months ago, shifting their designation from commercial transit corridor, which was what made them valuable to a railroad operation, to agricultural use, which was worth roughly 1/5 as much. The reclassification had happened 3 months before her father's illness became serious and 8 months before he died. The timing was suggestive. Alderman was a man who looked like he'd been hired to appear trustworthy and had worked hard at that appearance for many years. He had good posture and a careful handshake, and he said everything in the measured tones of a man who had learned that slow speech made lies sound more like facts. These reclassifications were entirely routine, he told her, leaning back in his chair with his hands folded. The county commission reviewed the corridor designations in February of '86 and determined that the projected rail spur timeline had shifted. Shifted to when? That would depend on the railroad's planning schedule. Which is something I would know about, she said, given that the railroad's planning schedule in this region is something my company has significant input into. And I have no record of any communication to my father's office about a timeline shift in February of '86. Alderman's hand stayed folded. I'm afraid I can only speak to the county records. Of course. She closed the folder she'd been reading from. I'll need copies of the commission minutes from that February meeting. I can have those prepared today. A small pause. That may take some time to... Mr. Alderman. She looked at him evenly. My company controls the financing for the rail spur that this county has been waiting on for 2 years. That spur either gets built or it doesn't, and that decision runs through my office. The commission minutes, today. He got her the minutes by 4 o'clock. They were incomplete. 2 pages that should have been there weren't, but they were enough to show her that the reclassification vote had been 5-1, which meant 1 commissioner had dissented, which meant there was at least 1 person in this county who had thought this was wrong. She wanted to know who that person was. She went back to the blacksmith shop at 7 o'clock that evening. Not because of the lantern. He'd said tomorrow morning, and she believed him, but because she'd realized during the walk back to her rented room that she'd left her gloves on his workbench, and she needed them. The forge was still going. She could see the orange light through the cracks in the shuttered windows. She knocked. It's open? He was working on a set of hinges for what looked like a barn door, bending the iron around a mandrel with a motion that looked effortless and probably wasn't. He glanced up when she came in. Gloves, she said before he could ask. He looked at the bench. Her gloves were there, folded neatly. He hadn't moved them, but someone had folded them, and she was fairly sure that someone was him. She picked them up. Thank you. The woman came in, he said, without looking up from the hinge. Mrs. Calloway paid me $3, didn't ask where the rest came from. Good. She cried again. People do that. Not usually in my shop. He set the hinge down and looked at her. She said you told her it was handled before you even came inside and talked to me. Vivian considered this. I was reasonably confident. On the basis of what? The hammer, she said. I could hear it from outside, the rhythm of it. I've been in enough manufacturing operations to know the difference between someone who's just doing the work and someone who's doing it right. She paused. You were doing it right. He absorbed this. Then, surprisingly, he laughed. Not a big laugh, just a small one that seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her. That's the strangest compliment I've ever received, he said. I give strange compliments. She put on her gloves. Good evening, Mr. Hale. Good evening, Miss Ashcroft. She was at the door. The 2 missing pages from the commission minutes. She stopped, turned. I beg your pardon? He was looking at her steadily. He'd set down his work entirely. February 1886, the reclassification vote. Commissioner Alderman presented the motion. Commissioner Briggs seconded it. Commissioners Hewitt, Farley, and Dugan voted with them. Commissioner Weller voted against, and his objection was entered into the minutes. He paused. Then Weller had a fire in his house in April, lost most of his personal papers, and 2 pages from the official meeting minutes went missing sometime in the spring. The room was very quiet. How do you know this? She said. Because Weller comes to me. He picked up the hammer again, not in a threatening way, just handling it the way men with his kind of work handled their tools when they were thinking. His property shares a fence line with a Briggs grazing parcel. After the fire, Briggs started pushing the fence. Weller's been fighting it for a year. He told me about the commission vote because he wanted me to know why Briggs was angry with him. Commissioner Briggs, she said, is that related to Colton Briggs, his father, Harlan? Harlan Briggs is on the county commission. He looked at her. Colton owns the cattle operation. Harlan controls the legal machinery. They've been working that combination for about 20 years. Vivian was quiet for a moment. Why are you telling me this? Because Weller is a decent man, and he's been losing ground for a year, and he doesn't have anyone in his corner who has the resources to do anything about it. He set the hammer down again. And because you walked into my shop today and paid for a widow's harrow without being asked, and that tells me something about what kind of person you are. She studied him. He met her eyes without flinching and without the particular kind of performance that men usually gave when they were trying to impress her. He just looked at her the way someone looks at another person when they're deciding whether they trust them. I'd like to speak with Commissioner Weller, she said. I thought you might. He reached under the workbench and produced a folded piece of paper. He'll be at the feed store tomorrow at 8. I wrote down the address. She took the paper. It was already written. He'd expected her to come back. You were very certain I'd return. You left your gloves. He picked up the hinge again. And I thought there was a chance you'd left them on purpose. She did not answer that. She walked out into the night with the address in her hand and the sound of his hammer resuming behind her, steady and patient, doing the work. Colton Briggs introduced himself the next morning outside the land office, which was not a coincidence. He was already there when she arrived, leaning against the post at the corner with his hat pushed back in a way that said he'd thought about this angle before striking it. He was, she had to concede, exactly what the word cowboy produced in the imagination. Broad-shouldered, clean-shaved, with an easy smile that had probably opened more doors than most men's money. He wore his confidence the way some men wore expensive clothes, not as something he'd acquired, but as something he'd been born into and had never thought to question. Miss Ashcroft, he said, and pushed off from the post to extend a hand. Colton Briggs. I believe we have some common interests in this county. Do we? She said. We do. He fell into step beside her as she walked, which she hadn't invited, but which he apparently hadn't waited for. Your family holds railroad interests. My family holds land that any rail spur through this county would need to cross. Seems like the kind of thing that could benefit us both, with the right cooperation. The right cooperation, she repeated. There's a dinner at the Ashford Hotel Friday evening. Local families, business interests, a chance to get acquainted. He smiled. I'd be honored if you'd allow me to escort you. She stopped walking and turned to look at him fully. He had the face of a man who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. Thank you for the invitation, she said. I'll make my own way there. The smile stayed. Of course. I'll look forward to seeing you. He tipped his hat and went back to the post. and she went into the land office, and she did not look back, which was something she was having to do a lot of in this town. She met Commissioner Weller at the feed store at 8 o'clock. He was a compact, precise man in his 60s who had the bearing of someone who'd spent years in a position that required dignity and had recently discovered that dignity didn't protect you from much. He shook her hand and looked at her with the cautious hope of a man who'd learned to be careful about hope. "Mr. Hale said you'd come," he said. "He seems to say a number of accurate things." Weller's mouth moved in something that wasn't quite a smile. "He's a good man. Doesn't make a noise about it, which is either humility or a survival strategy in this county. Maybe both." They sat in the back corner of the store, away from the morning traffic, and he told her everything: the February vote, the pressure that had come before it from Harlan Briggs and 2 other commission members, framed as a routine procedural adjustment, the fire at his house, which the county had ruled accidental, but which had happened 2 weeks after he'd filed a formal objection to the reclassification with the state land office. The missing minutes. "I have copies," he said. He'd been carrying them, she realized. The same folded pages she'd seen referenced in Alderman's records. "I made copies the same day the vote happened. I knew." He looked at his hands. "I knew what they were doing. I just didn't know what I could do about it alone." Vivian looked at the pages. They were exactly what she needed. "You're not alone now," she said. He looked up. "I need 2 weeks," she said. "Don't do anything. Don't file anything. Don't talk to anyone about this except Gideon Hale. Can you do that?" "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to go to the dinner on Friday and find out what Colton Briggs actually wants and what he knows. And I'm going to have my lawyers in San Antonio start building a case while I'm doing it." She folded the copied pages and put them in her bag. "And I'm going to pick up a repaired lantern from a blacksmith this afternoon." Weller looked at her. "A lantern." "A lantern." She stood. "Small repairs matter, Mr. Weller. That's been the lesson of this county so far." She left him sitting with something in his face she recognized after a moment as relief, which was a thing she rarely produced in people, and which she found, to her own mild surprise, that she was glad to see. The lantern was ready. Gideon had it sitting on the edge of the workbench when she came in just before noon, and she could tell immediately that it was right. The brass had been cleaned, the housing crack was invisible unless you knew to look for it, and the mechanism that had been jammed for a week moved smoothly under her thumb. "What did you do to it?" she asked. "Remove the pressure on the feed wheel, reset the housing. The previous repair had used the wrong grade of solder. It contracted differently from the brass when it cooled, which is why the crack happened in the first place." He looked at the lantern in her hands. "It'll hold now." "How much?" "Nothing. The work wasn't complicated." "Mr. Hale, I don't charge for work that takes me 20 minutes, he said. "If I did, I'd have to charge for the time I spent telling people their hinges are fine and they're imagining the squeak." She almost laughed. "That happens?" "More than you'd think. People hear something wrong and they want someone to confirm it." He leaned against the workbench. "Did you find Weller?" "I did." "And?" "He had what I needed." She set the lantern down and looked at him. "You knew he would. You knew before I walked back in here last night." "I knew he'd been waiting for someone with the means to do something. I didn't know if you'd be the person." "What decided it for you?" He thought about it. "The harrow," he said finally. "You paid for it without making a production out of it. No announcement, no expectation that Mrs. Calloway would know who to be grateful to. Most people who do charity want someone to see them doing it." He looked at her directly. "You just wanted the thing fixed." She was quiet for a moment. "My father was the same way." Then he must have been a good man." "He was." She picked up the lantern. "The dinner Friday. Are you invited?" He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite parse. "I'm the blacksmith." "That's not an answer. No one invites the blacksmith to social dinners, Miss Ashcroft." "Would you come if they did?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked away, back at the workbench, back at the iron and the tools and the world of his shop. "I have work Friday evening." "You're choosing work over the dinner." "I always choose work." There was something underneath it that he wasn't saying, and she heard the shape of it even if she couldn't make out the exact words. "I'll report back," she said, "in case anything useful comes out of it." "That's kind of you." She walked to the door. Behind her, she heard him pick up the hammer. "Miss Ashcroft." She turned. He was looking at her, the hammer loose in his hand, and he seemed to be deciding something. "Briggs is going to be charming," he said. "He's good at it. Better than most people realize until it's too late." "I've managed charming men before." "I know." He held her gaze. "I just wanted you to know that someone in this town is paying attention to what he actually does rather than how he does it." She understood that he wasn't talking about himself. He was talking about her, and about the fact that he had noticed she was paying the same kind of attention. "Good evening, Mr. Hale," she said. "Good evening, Miss Ashcroft." She walked back into the afternoon light with the repaired lantern in her hand, and somewhere behind her the hammer started up again, and she listened to the rhythm of it for a moment before she rounded the corner, steady, patient, getting the work right, and thought that she had not expected this town to have exactly this person in it, and that the week had already been more interesting than the account books had suggested it would be. She would need to stay longer than planned. The surveys could wait. The lawyers in San Antonio were already working, and Colton Briggs was going to be charming on Friday, which meant she needed every advantage she could find before then. She held the lantern up to the afternoon light and watched the mechanism move. Smooth and certain, the crack in the housing gone, as though it had never been there, and thought about small repairs and what it meant that the man who'd fixed it hadn't wanted anything for the work. In her experience, that was either the most suspicious thing in the world or the rarest. She was beginning to suspect it was the rarest. The dinner at the Ashford Hotel was exactly what Vivian had expected, which was the problem with it. Long tables dressed in white linen that had been ironed so many times it had lost its texture. Candles that cost more than most families in this county spent on food in a week. Men in their best coats standing in arrangements that looked casual and weren't. Each of them positioned relative to the others with the precision of chess pieces on a board where everyone understood the game except the people who thought they were just having dinner. Colton Briggs was already at the center of it when she arrived, and she watched him work the room for 3 minutes from the doorway before she walked in. Watched the way he moved from one cluster of men to the next, how he touched shoulders and laughed at the right moments and made each person feel like they were the one he'd come to see. It was a real skill. She didn't underestimate it. He saw her come in and cross the room with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never once in his life arrived somewhere and found himself unwanted. "Miss Ashcroft." He offered his arm with a smile that she suspected had weakened many reasonable women's better instincts. "You look like you belong here." "I'm not sure that's a compliment in this room," she said, but she let him walk her toward the nearest group because the information she wanted was in this room, and Colton Briggs was the shortest path to it. His father, Harlan Briggs, found her within the first half hour. He was a shorter, heavier version of his son, with the same easy manner but less warmth in the eyes. The version of the performance after decades of practice had turned it into something purely functional. He shook her hand and said all the right things about her father and about the railroad interests and about how important good relationships between business and community were, and she smiled and agreed and filed everything away. "The county has been very supportive of rail development," Harlan said. "Very forward-thinking. The commission has worked hard to ensure the right parcels are in the right classifications for the right kinds of use." "I've been studying those classifications," she said pleasantly. Something moved behind his eyes. Not alarm exactly, more like the recalibration she was starting to recognize in this family. "Good. Important to understand the landscape before making decisions." "I agree completely," she said. Colton reappeared at her elbow and steered her gently toward the dinner table with the practiced ease of a man who'd learned that the most effective way to end a conversation was to begin another one. She let him. She'd gotten what she needed from Harlan, which was confirmation that he knew she was looking and that he wasn't afraid of that, which told her that whatever had been done to the records he believed was buried well enough to withstand scrutiny. He was wrong about that, but she wasn't going to tell him yet. She sat through dinner next to Colton and learned things about him that she hadn't expected to learn. He was not stupid. That was the first thing, and the most important. She had come in prepared for a man who relied entirely on his looks and his father's machinery, and that was inaccurate. He understood cattle operations with real depth, could talk about land management and water rights, and seasonal grazing patterns with the fluency of someone who'd done the work, not just inherited it. He was funny occasionally. He had opinions about things she hadn't anticipated him having opinions about. What he didn't have was any apparent awareness that any of this might have costs. That the land his family had accumulated through 2 decades of commission maneuvering had come from somewhere, had belonged to someone. That Commissioner Weller's fence line hadn't pushed itself inward. She tested it carefully, the way she'd learned to test things, obliquely, with questions that sounded like curiosity. "The Weller property," she said toward the end of the main course. "I understand it borders some of your grazing land." Colton's fork paused for a fraction of a second. "Old Weller. Good man. Stubborn as a post about his fences, but that's his right. Is there a dispute?" "A disagreement." He smiled. "The kind of thing neighbors work out eventually, nothing dramatic." She nodded and moved the conversation elsewhere, and he followed it easily, and she thought about what Gideon had said, that Briggs was good at this, better than most people realized until it was too late. And she thought that was exactly right, and that the thing making it possible was that Colton genuinely didn't seem to register what he was doing as wrong. It was just the natural order. His family was strong, so it accumulated. That was how the world worked, in his understanding of it. She wondered if that made it better or worse than malice, and decided it made it worse. She was back at the blacksmith shop Saturday morning before 8, which was early enough that she hadn't entirely thought through why she was going there instead of sending Holt with a message. She told herself it was because she needed to update Gideon on what she'd learned, which was true but incomplete. He was already working. She was starting to suspect he was always already working. "How was it?" he asked, without looking up from the piece he was at. "Informative." She sat on the stool near the bench. There was only one stool, and she'd started using it without asking, and he hadn't said anything about that. "Harlan Briggs knows I'm looking at the reclassification. He wasn't worried about it, which means he thinks whatever was done to the records is buried deep enough." "Is it?" "Weller's copies are enough to raise questions with the state land office. Questions are enough to trigger a formal review." She watched him work. He was making something that looked like a set of decorative gates for what must be a significant property, the kind of fine detail work she hadn't expected from a shop this size. Colton doesn't know what his father actually does. Or he knows, and he's decided not to look at it. "Second one," Gideon said. "You sound certain." Colton's not stupid, and he's not blind. He set down the piece he was working on and looked at her directly. He knows. He just decided a long time ago that knowing and doing something about it are 2 different obligations. Vivian thought about that. "You've known him a long time." "All my life. We went to the same school for 3 years before his family built the private one." He picked up a smaller tool, a chisel, and returned to the detail work on the gate. "He was a decent kid, not mean. He just grew into the shape of his family the way water grows into whatever you pour it into." That's a generous interpretation. It's an accurate one. Generous would be saying it makes him less responsible. He tapped the chisel carefully. It doesn't. She watched his hands. The detail work on the gate was extraordinarily fine. Scrollwork in the iron that had a living quality to it. Curves that looked like they'd grown rather than been hammered into shape. "Who commissioned these?" she asked. "The Alderman family." He said it without inflection. She stared at him. "The surveyor." "His wife. For their garden." He glanced at the gate. "She ordered them in the spring. I don't choose my customers by their politics." "That's either very principled or very impractical." "Probably both." He set the chisel down and straightened. "Mrs. Alderman is not her husband. She makes quilts for the families in the Low Quarter, and she's been doing it for 15 years. He looked at Vivian. People are not just their worst associations. She thought about that for a while, sitting on the stool in the heat of the forge, listening to the small sounds of the shop. "You make it sound simple," she said. "I make it sound like what it is. Simple's not the same as easy." She didn't have an answer for that, so she didn't try to find one. The difficulty she hadn't anticipated was Colton's persistence, which turned out to be of a different quality than his dinner charm. The charm was performed. The persistence was real. He appeared at the hotel Sunday morning to ask if she'd like to ride out and see the western parcels. "The ones that might be relevant to your rail corridor interests," he said, which was a business pretext thin enough to read through but not impolite enough to object to directly. She went because the parcels actually were relevant and because she wanted to see what he'd show her and what he'd leave out. He showed her everything, which surprised her. They rode for 4 hours through land that was genuinely impressive. Good grass, good water access, the kind of terrain that a rail line would cut through cleanly without major grade work. He talked about it with knowledge and even affection, the way people talk about things they've actually spent time with. He pointed out a hawk's nest in a dead cottonwood. He stopped his horse at a ridge overlook and let her take in the view without filling it with words, which was a restraint she hadn't expected from him. "This is beautiful land," she said, and meant it. "Best in the county." He said it simply, without the usual performance of pride, just a statement. "My grandfather filed the first claim on this section in '51. My father doubled it. I'll double it again." He paused. "That's the plan, anyway." "Plans change." "Some plans do." He looked at her sideways. "Some don't." She let it pass. They rode back in the late afternoon, and at the hotel he helped her down from the horse with a politeness that was reflexive rather than calculated. And she thought that this was the most complicated thing about him, that the surface was not fake. The charm was real charm. The politeness was real politeness. It was what was underneath that was the problem. The entitlement that ran so deep it had become structural, invisible to him in the way that foundations are invisible to people living in houses. "I appreciate the ride," she said. "My pleasure." He held his hat. "There's a gathering next Saturday. Nothing formal, a few families, some music. Would you consider—" "I'll think about it," she said. He nodded once, satisfied with that in the way he was satisfied with most things, and rode away. She stood in front of the hotel for a moment, and then she walked 2 blocks south and 1 block east to the blacksmith shop, because she'd been thinking all day about what Gideon had said about people not being just their worst associations, and she wanted to think about it out loud with someone who would argue back honestly. The shop was locked. A small sign, handwritten, nailed to the door, said "back at 4." She had not considered that he might have somewhere else to be. She walked back to the hotel and wrote letters to her San Antonio lawyers and thought about how rarely she ran into the closed doors of other people's schedules, and how surprisingly, she searched for the word, grounding it was. He was at the Henderson farm. She found this out Monday morning when Mrs. Calloway came to the hotel with a fresh-baked pie that Vivian hadn't asked for and didn't know what to do with, and stayed for 45 minutes telling her about the town with the particular thoroughness of a woman who has decided that someone needs to know things. "Gideon's over at the Hendersons today," Mrs. Calloway said, with the comfortable authority of someone reporting on the weather. "Jim Henderson broke 3 ribs in October and can't do the forge work himself. He does some smithing too, just basic stuff. And Gideon's been going over on Sundays and Mondays to keep the Henderson equipment in order until Jim heals up." "He does that on top of his own work?" Vivian said. "Has been for 2 months." Mrs. Calloway cut a piece of the pie and put it in front of Vivian with the decisive authority of a woman who considered eating non-negotiable. "That's Gideon. He doesn't announce things. He just does them, and then he goes home and goes back to his own work." "Does he have family here?" Mrs. Calloway shook her head. "Came here from East Texas about 6 years ago. Bought the shop from old Marcus Webb, who was retiring. Didn't know a soul." She folded her hands on the table. "Built everything himself. The reputation, the business, well, he's built a whole life out of nothing, and he's done it one piece at a time, the same way he makes things in that forge." She paused. "Not that he'd ever say that about himself." "No," Vivian said. "He wouldn't." Mrs. Calloway gave her a look that said she'd noticed something in that response, but was too polite to press it, which was probably more perceptive than Vivian had been counting on. "He's a good man," Mrs. Calloway said simply. "There aren't as many of them as people like to think." Vivian ate the pie, which was extraordinary, and thought about a man who spent his Sundays and Mondays keeping other people's equipment running while everyone in the county went to dinners where they talked about cooperation and then came home and pushed their neighbor's fence line. She went back to the shop Tuesday afternoon, and he was there, and she sat on the stool and they talked for 2 hours about things that had nothing to do with Harlan Briggs or land classifications or rail corridor easements, which was not what she'd planned, but which happened anyway. He told her about iron, about the specific way different grades of it behaved under heat, the way you learned to read the color of the forge to know when the metal was ready, the way the hammer told you things through your hands that your eyes couldn't see. He talked about it the way people talk about things they've spent years paying close attention to, with a precision that wasn't technical language but was something better, the language of someone who'd earned their understanding through their hands. She told him about rail financing, which she would normally have delivered as a summary for businessmen, but which she found herself explaining differently. The actual mechanics of it, the way you assembled capital from multiple investors with different time horizons and risk tolerances, the way a rail route was as much a financial structure as a physical one. He listened the way he looked at broken equipment, fully, without performing interest, actually trying to understand. The parcels that were reclassified, he said. Even if you get the review, and even if the review reverses the classification, does the reversal actually protect the corridor? She looked at him. That's exactly the right question. What's the answer? Probably not by itself. The classification protects it on paper, but Harlan Briggs controls enough commission votes to reclassify again if he wants to, and a state review takes 6 months minimum. She'd been working on this. What protects it is a signed agreement with my company that predates any future commission action. If we can get a formal easement recorded before Briggs knows what we're doing, he'll know what you're doing. Yes. She looked at the gate he was still working on. It was close to finished now, the scrollwork intricate and certain. But there's a difference between knowing and being able to stop it. He was quiet for a moment, tapping the chisel idly against his palm. Weller, he said. He owns a strip of land along the eastern edge of the corridor. If Weller sold that strip to your company before any of the easement filings, then the corridor would have a private landowner in the middle of it, she said slowly, which means any reclassification of the surrounding parcels wouldn't affect the through line. It's a thin solution. It's a real one. She was already thinking through the timing. Would Weller sell? Not for money. He's been on that land 30 years. Gideon looked at her. But if the sale included a right of residency, if he could stay on the property and keep farming it while your company holds the deed, he might. She looked at him for a moment. You've been thinking about this. He shrugged, one shoulder, a motion that managed to be both honest and deflecting. I have time to think in the forge. The hammer doesn't need my brain once my hands know what to do. You'd have made a very good lawyer. He laughed, a real one this time, surprised out of him. That's a terrible thing to say to someone. I meant it as a compliment. I know you did, which is what makes it terrible. He set the chisel down and stretched his back, the movement of someone who'd been bent over fine work for too long. I don't want to be a lawyer. I want to make things that work. And yet you've just constructed a legal strategy. I've suggested a thing, he said. You're the one who'll have to make it work. She looked at him. The afternoon light was coming in low through the shop's west-facing door, and it caught the dust in the air and made the room look warmer than it was. And she thought that she had spent 2 weeks in this town doing work she'd expected to be tedious and straightforward, and had instead found herself in almost daily conversation with a man who challenged her thinking the way very few people had, which was the thing she'd wanted most and found least in her actual life. She thought about saying some version of this, and then didn't because it was too soon and too much, and she wasn't entirely sure what she meant by it anyway. I'll talk to Weller tomorrow, she said instead. He'll want to hear it from you directly. He doesn't trust secondhand anything anymore. I wouldn't either. She stood up from the stool and pulled her coat straight. Outside, the light was going orange. She'd been here longer than she'd intended again. The gate's almost done, she said. He glanced at it. 2 more days. It's beautiful work. He didn't answer that directly, just looked at the gate with the evaluating squint of a craftsman who could see all the places where his own work fell slightly short of what he'd intended, which was a look she recognized from a different kind of work. It's close, he said. She went to the door. Behind her, she heard him pick up the chisel. Miss Ashcroft. She'd stopped turning at his voice now, just stood still and waited. Colton's going to ask you to the Saturday gathering again. Probably through an intermediary this time. He'll send someone so it doesn't feel like pressure. She hadn't told him about Sunday's ride. She turned. How did you know about... He talked about it at the saloon Monday night, Gideon said. He told Fletcher Morris that he'd taken you out to see the Western parcels, and that you were the most interesting woman he'd met in 5 years. She absorbed that. He said that? Fletcher told me Tuesday morning when he came in for a new bit for his drill. He was looking at the chisel in his hand, not at her. I thought you should know he's serious, not just performing. Something in the careful way he said it made her study him for a moment. Does that bother you? He looked up then, held her gaze for a beat longer than necessary. I just think you should have complete information, he said, which was not an answer to the question she'd asked, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so. Good evening, Mr. Hale. Good evening, Miss Ashcroft. She walked home in the cooling dark and tried to think about Weller and easements and the timing of the state land review, and mostly succeeded except for the parts where she didn't. The intermediary was Fletcher Morris, as it turned out, who appeared at the hotel Wednesday morning to invite her, on behalf of no one specific, to a gathering of good people on Saturday. Casual, just music and food and good company. She said she'd think about it, and he tipped his hat and left. She was still thinking about it when a boy appeared at the hotel door Thursday morning with a note. No signature, just an address and a time, 8 o'clock Thursday evening, and a single sentence. Weller's son is in town. You should hear what he has to say. The handwriting was Gideon's. She recognized it from the address he'd written her the first time. Weller's son was a man of about 40 named Cal, who'd come up from San Antonio where he worked as a clerk for a county assessor's office. He'd heard, through his father's letters, that someone was looking at the reclassification, and he'd come with a box of documents that he'd spent 2 years quietly accumulating from the State Archives Public Records Division. They met in Weller's front room. Cal, the elder Weller, Vivian, and Gideon, who sat in the corner and said almost nothing but whose presence in the room felt, she thought, like the presence of something structural, something load-bearing. Cal laid the documents out on the table. They showed, across 8 separate transactions over 4 years, a consistent pattern. Parcels reclassified, their values dropped, then acquired by entities that traced back through 2 or 3 corporate layers to Harlan Briggs, or men closely connected to him, then recombined and sold at original commercial transit prices to buyers who didn't know the history. It was a clean machine. It had been running for years. And every piece of evidence that should have been in the official record had been removed, except for what was sitting on this table. Vivian looked at the documents for a long time. This is enough, she said. Cal looked at her. For what? For a formal fraud complaint to the state attorney's office. She looked up. Not just a land review, an actual criminal complaint. Silence in the room. That's a different thing than what we talked about, Weller said carefully. I know. She looked at him. It's also the right thing. If we just fix the easement and walk away, this machine keeps running. The next person who comes along without resources to fight it loses. She paused. I can't unknow what's on this table. Weller looked at his son. Cal looked at the table. From the corner, Gideon said quietly, It's her call to make. Everyone looked at him. He was looking at Vivian. She's the one with the resources to see it through, he said. And she's the one who walked in here in the first place. It's her call. Vivian held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at Weller. I'll need to know you're willing to testify if it comes to that. Weller was quiet for a long time. Then he straightened in his chair, the bearing of a man who'd spent a year diminished by someone else's power and had just decided he was done with that. Tell me what you need, he said. They stayed until nearly midnight, going through every document. Gideon made coffee at some point. She noticed this without remarking on it, the way he moved through the Weller kitchen with the ease of someone who'd been there before, who'd probably sat in this same house on other evenings when the old man had nobody else to talk to. When they finally stood up to leave, Cal shook her hand and said, My father said you were the kind of person who actually does what they say. I try to be, she said. He said the blacksmith told him you were. She looked at Gideon, who was putting on his coat and appearing completely unaware that this statement had just been made in the room. She decided not to address it directly. They walked out into the cold night together, their boots loud on the frost-hardened path, and he walked beside her rather than behind her or ahead of her, at exactly the same pace, which she noticed. "Thank you," she said, "for finding Cal. He found me. He came into the shop Wednesday asking if I knew his father's situation." He looked ahead. "I just introduced the right people to each other." "You do that a lot." "Do what?" "Put the right pieces together," she said. "Then step back and let them work." He was quiet. The cold air was still, and the stars over Redstone Crossing were the kind of stars you only got when there was no competition for the sky. "It's what you do in a forge," he said finally. "You put things together in the right configuration, and you let the heat do the rest." He paused. "I didn't invent the heat. I just understand it well enough to use it." She thought about that for the rest of the walk home, and for a long time after that, lying awake in the rented room with the lantern he'd repaired burning quietly on the table beside her, throwing its steady, small light into the dark. The letters to San Antonio went out Friday morning, carried by a rider Vivienne paid extra to move fast and ask no questions. She wrote 3 of them, one to her primary lawyer, one to the state attorney's office in Austin, one to a man named Gerald Fitch, who had worked for her father for 20 years and who knew more about how land fraud moved through county systems than anyone she trusted. She sealed them herself and handed them to the writer herself and watched him leave before she went back inside to eat breakfast, which she did not taste. The thing about setting a legal process in motion was that it had a momentum of its own once it started, and that momentum was not always controllable, and the people it was aimed at had a way of feeling it coming even before anything official arrived. She had seen this happen twice in her father's business dealings, and both times the gap between filing and response had been the most dangerous interval, the period when the people being investigated still had full freedom to act and a new reason to act badly. She didn't know how long she had before Harlan Briggs found out something was moving. She thought probably not long. Saturday came and went without the gathering, at least without her at it. She sent Fletcher Morris a polite note declining, citing business obligations, which was both true and useful. It was better for Colton to think she was busy than to think she was avoiding him, because busy was temporary, and avoidance would make him press harder. She spent Saturday in the rented room going through every document Cal Weller had left her, mapping the transaction pattern on paper until she could see its full shape, which took most of the day and confirmed that it was more extensive than even Cal had realized when he'd assembled it. Harlan Briggs had been doing this for nearly a decade. Not just the rail corridor parcels. Smaller transactions, too. Older ones, going back to before Colton would have been old enough to understand what his father was doing. It made Gideon's assessment harder to hold, the idea that Colton had chosen not to see, rather than been too young to. She'd have to revise her timeline of when he could have known. She went to tell Gideon about this on Sunday afternoon, not because she had to, but because he was the person she wanted to think out loud with, which was something she was going to have to stop pretending surprised her. He was outside the shop when she arrived, crouched next to a wheel that had come off a farm wagon, turning the axle housing in his hands with the focused attention he brought to every broken thing. A man she didn't recognize was standing nearby with the particular posture of someone waiting for bad news about a mechanical problem. "The housing's cracked through," Gideon said to him. "Not just surface, all the way through." The man's face fell. "Can you fix it?" "I can make you a new one. Takes 2 days." He set the housing down and looked up at the man. "You need the wagon before then?" "I need it tomorrow. Got a load to take to Abilene." Gideon was quiet for a moment, thinking about something. "You can use mine," he said. The man stared. "Your wagon." "I'm not using it this week. It's in the back. You take it to Abilene, bring it back Wednesday, your housing will be ready by then." "I can't just... That's your... It's a wagon," Gideon said, in the tone of a man who had already moved on from this conversation in his head. "I'll get the housing started today. Come back Wednesday." The man stood there for another moment, visibly uncertain about whether this kind of thing actually happened, and then he said "thank you" 3 times quickly and went around the back to find the wagon. Gideon stood up, saw Vivienne standing at the edge of the yard, and didn't appear particularly startled. "How long have you been there?" he asked. "Long enough." She walked toward him. "You lend your wagon to strangers." He's not a stranger. He's Pete Garner's cousin from over near Sweetwater. He picked up the cracked housing and carried it inside. Come in if you're coming. She followed him. The gate he'd been working on was gone, delivered to the Alderman house, she assumed, and the space on the bench where it had been was now occupied by the early stages of something else, a set of fence posts with decorative caps that were just rough shapes so far. I've been through all of Cal Weller's documents, she said. She sat on the stool. It goes back further than we thought. Harlan Briggs has been running this same pattern since 1879. 8 years. Gideon set the cracked housing on the bench and examined it under the better light. How many parcels? 16 that I can trace, possibly more where the documentation is thinner. She watched him turn the housing. The rail corridor parcels are the most recent and the most valuable, but they're not the beginning of it. He's been practicing on smaller targets for years. Anyone try to stop him before? Weller's the only one who went on record. The others, I found 2 other commissioners who voted against various reclassifications over the years. One of them sold his property and left the county in 1882. The other one died. She paused. Accident, officially. Gideon set the housing down. He didn't say anything for a moment. What kind of accident? Horse threw him. He was found 2 days later. She looked at him. I don't know if it was actually an accident. I don't have anything that says it wasn't, but I think you should know the full picture. He nodded slowly. Does Weller know? I'm going to tell him tomorrow. She folded her hands in her lap. Which is why I wanted to think through it first, because if Harlan Briggs is capable of that, then Weller is in more danger than we thought he was. He said it plainly, without drama, which was both better and worse than if he'd been alarmed. And so are you. Possibly. Not possibly. He looked at her directly. You've sent letters to the state attorney's office. You're the person who found the documents. If Briggs finds that out before the formal complaint is registered, the letters went Friday. Gerald Fitch will have mine by Tuesday. The process will be underway before Briggs can move through official channels. Official channels aren't the only channels. She held his gaze. I know that. Do you? It wasn't quite a question. I've been in this kind of fight before, she said. Not the same, but similar. My father bought a rail line in East Texas in '81 that 3 different interests tried to take back from him through a combination of legal maneuvering and other pressure. He held it, she paused. I watched how he held it. How? By making sure too many people knew what was at stake for any single action to quietly solve the problem. She tilted her head slightly. Which is why I told you everything, and why I told Weller and his son, and why I'm going to tell 2 more people this week whose interests align with mine. He looked at her for a moment with something she couldn't name precisely. Not admiration exactly, something more careful than that. Who are the 2 people? He said. Fletcher Morris. He doesn't like Harlan Briggs. I could tell at the dinner. He's been pushed around by the commission on a water access dispute for 2 years, and he's angry about it. He is, Gideon confirmed. Who's the second? You tell me. Who in this county has the most to lose if the rail corridor doesn't come through, and who has the most credibility if they go public about it? He thought. Doc Reeves, he said after a moment. He's been trying to get medical supply deliveries regularized for 3 years. The rail spur is the only thing that makes that possible at a reasonable cost. And he's the most trusted man in the county. He paused. He won't get involved in political fights as a rule. Will he get involved in a fraud case? Another pause. Longer. Maybe, if he understood what it was actually about. Can you take me to him? He looked at the cracked housing on his bench, then at the stool where she was sitting, then at her. Tuesday, he said. He's at the clinic Tuesday mornings. Tuesday. She nodded. Thank you. She stood to go. He walked with her to the door of the shop, which he hadn't done before, and they stood for a moment in the doorway while the cold afternoon light fell across the yard. You should be careful, he said. I'm always careful. I know. I'm saying it anyway. She looked at him. There was something in his face that he was being precise about not showing, the controlled quality of a person who has decided exactly how much of something they're going to let out. She recognized it because she did the same thing constantly. I'll be careful, she said. He nodded. She walked across the yard and out the gate, and behind her she heard him go back inside and pick up his tools, and the sound of work starting again followed her down the street. Christmas was coming on the county the way it came in small Texas towns, not all at once but in accumulations, green branches appearing in windows, the smell of wood smoke thickening, the general pace of the street slowing down by degrees as people allowed themselves to move toward the end of the year. The Ashford Hotel put a wreath on its door. The dry goods store stacked oranges in the window, expensive and impractical, the luxury that said celebration even when the rest of the budget didn't. It was in this first week of December, in this softening of the usual frontier business, that Colton Briggs made his move. He came to the hotel Monday morning and asked for her in the lobby, formally, hat in hand, which was different from the easy confidence of his usual approaches. She came downstairs and found him standing in the middle of the lobby carpet with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, not the performed ease of the dinner or the genuine enthusiasm of the land tour, but something that was clearly costing him some effort. "I'd like to speak plainly," he said. "All right," she said. "Not here." He glanced at the desk clerk, who was making a thorough job of appearing not to listen. "Could we walk?" They walked. The morning was cold and still, the kind of cold that wasn't bitter yet, but had the quality of something getting ready to be. He was quiet for half a block, which was unusual for him, and she waited. "I know you're looking at the reclassified parcels," he said. She kept her pace even. "I've been quite open about that. My father knows, too." He said it carefully, like he was placing something breakable on a shelf. "He's not concerned, exactly. He thinks whatever you find will be manageable." He stopped walking. She stopped, too. He looked at her directly in the flat morning light. "I don't think you're someone who manages easily." "That's an accurate assessment." "Vivian." It was the first time he'd used her given name. "Whatever you found, whatever you think you've found, there are ways to handle this that don't have to become something damaging. To a lot of people. Not just my father." She looked at him. "Is this a warning?" "No." He looked genuinely troubled by the question. I'm trying to—" He stopped, pushed a hand through his hair, which was the first unmanaged gesture she'd seen from him. "I'm trying to tell you that I know my father is not a simple man, that some of what he's done, some of it I don't know the details of, and I'm aware that's a choice I made." He held her gaze. "But I'm talking to you as myself, not as his son. I'm asking if there's a version of this that doesn't have to be the thing it looks like it's becoming." She was quiet for a moment. She thought about what Gideon had said about Colton growing into the shape of his family like water into a vessel. And she thought about the version of him that was standing in front of her right now, which was the first time she'd seen anything in him that looked like real discomfort. And she thought that discomfort was not the same as conscience, but it was sometimes where conscience started. "The version that doesn't become what it's becoming," she said carefully, "would require your father to stop doing what he's been doing for 8 years and to answer for what he's already done. That's the version." He absorbed that. 8 years. 16 parcels that I've traced, possibly more. He was quiet long enough that she could see him calculating, revising something. "I didn't know it went back that far." "I believe you." She said it without softening, but also without accusation. "That doesn't change what it is." He nodded, slow and heavy. "No," he said, "it doesn't." They stood in the cold street for another moment, and she thought that he was genuinely trying to figure out if there was a way through this that preserved something, and she couldn't tell him there was, because the only way through it that she could see required his father to lose, and the Briggs family had built its entire existence on the assumption that it didn't lose. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it, which surprised her slightly. He looked at her, then he put his hat back on and nodded once and walked away. And she watched him go and thought that she had just seen what it looked like when a man started to understand that the shape he'd been poured into might not be the only shape available, and that this understanding, arriving this late, was not comfortable. She went to the blacksmith shop. Gideon was in the middle of something when she arrived, a repair on a piece of mill equipment that had clearly fought him at some point because there was a long scrape across the back of his left hand that was dried now, but had bled significantly. And he looked up when she came in and read something in her face. "Sit down," he said. She sat. She told him about Colton. He listened without interrupting. "He's trying to find a way out," Gideon said when she finished. "I think so. He won't find one that satisfies everyone. There isn't one." "I know." He went back to the mill equipment, working at it with the steady focus that she'd come to recognize as his way of thinking. "What he's really asking," Gideon said after a while, "is whether you'd consider protecting him from his father's consequences. Separate the son from what the father did." "Can I do that?" "Legally? Probably, if he didn't directly participate." He tapped the metal piece carefully. "The question is whether doing that lets the machine keep running under new management." She hadn't thought of it that way. He could still inherit the land. Even if Harlan faces consequences, the land that was legitimately acquired stays with the family. He looked up. "Yeah." She sat with that for a moment. "That's not justice." "No, it's the law, which is a different thing." He set down his tool. "You can't always get both." She looked at her hands. "My father used to say that." "Smart man." "He was." She was quiet for a moment. "He also said that you do what you can do, and you don't waste time being angry about what you can't." "Also smart." She looked up at him. He was watching her with that careful attention that she'd stopped trying to categorize, the way he looked at things he was trying to understand fully before he acted on them. "Colton said something to me," she said, "on the way back to the hotel, before we stopped talking. She'd been deciding whether to tell him this. He said he thought I was spending a great deal of time at the blacksmith shop." Gideon went very still. He said it the way people say something when they want to say something else but are testing whether they can say it directly. "What was the something else?" Gideon's voice was even, carefully even. "I think he was asking whether there was a personal reason I kept coming here." She looked at him steadily. He didn't phrase it as a question, so I didn't answer it as one. A pause. The forge made its low, constant sound. "What would you have said?" Gideon asked, "if he'd phrased it as a question?" She held his gaze. "I would have said that I find the conversations here more useful than most of the conversations I have in a year." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked away, back at the mill equipment, and she watched something move through his expression that she couldn't fully read. It wasn't rejection, it was more complicated than that, had the quality of a man taking something out and looking at it briefly before deciding it needed to go back somewhere safe for now. "That's a generous thing to say," he said. "It's an accurate thing." She stood. She'd said enough. "Tuesday. Doc Reeves." "Tuesday," he confirmed without looking up. She left. The walk back to the hotel was 4 blocks, and she thought about something every step of them, though she would have been hard-pressed to say exactly what. Doc Reeves turned out to be a small, sharp-eyed man in his 50s, who had the manner of someone who'd spent decades in a room with sick people and had learned to read what wasn't being said at least as well as what was. He shook Vivian's hand and then looked at Gideon and said, "You brought an Ashcroft to my clinic, Hale. This is either very good or very bad." "Some of both," Gideon said. They sat in the back room of the clinic, which smelled of camphor and something medicinal she couldn't identify, and she laid out the full picture for him. The documents, the pattern, the timeline, the state attorney letter, all of it. He listened the way Gideon listened, completely, without performing reaction. When she finished, he was quiet for 30 seconds. Then he said, "Alderman." "The surveyor," she said. "He told me in '84 that the eastern approach parcels weren't suitable for transit corridor designation. Environmental concerns," he said. "Something about drainage." Reeves' expression didn't change, but something hardened in his eyes. I believed him. I stopped pushing on the rail supply issue for 2 years because I thought it was a terrain problem. "It wasn't a terrain problem," Vivian said. "I know that now." He looked at the table. 2 years. We lost 2 years of reliable medical supply access in this county because I believed a surveyor who was working for a man I had dinner with. He let that sit for a moment. "What do you need from me?" Your name, she said, on a statement about what Alderman told you in 1884 and when you said it. If this goes to a formal proceeding, that kind of evidence, a professional man of standing reporting a false representation that caused demonstrable harm, carries weight. He nodded slowly. Write it up and bring it back. I'll sign it. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Harlan Briggs has been on the board of 2 county institutions for 20 years. When this becomes public, this county is going to have a difficult few months. He looked between her and Gideon. Are you prepared for that? Yes, she said. He looked at Gideon. Yes, Gideon said. Reeves nodded once. Then let's make sure it's done right. Jeb. What she hadn't calculated, and what she perhaps should have, was how quickly word traveled in a small town when more than 2 people knew something significant. By Wednesday, she could feel it. The slight change in how people on the main street looked at her. Some of them with new interest, some with new wariness. The careful recalibration that happened when a community sensed that something was shifting in its power arrangements and was not yet sure which side was going to win. Fletcher Morris avoided her for the first time since she'd arrived, and she took that to mean he'd been spoken to, probably by the Briggs family, probably with a message about where his interests lay. Thursday morning, Holt came to her room at 7 with an expression that meant something had happened. A man came to the hotel last night, he said. After you'd gone up, he left a message. He handed her an envelope. Inside was a single card, no signature, 6 words written in a neat commercial hand. What you're looking for isn't there. She turned the card over, nothing on the back. Did you see the man? She asked. I was in the lobby. He came to the desk. Middle-aged, well-dressed, didn't give a name. She put the card in her coat pocket. Thank you, Holt. She went to the blacksmith shop at 8 before she'd had anything to eat and showed him the card. He read it, turned it over, handed it back. It means they know, he said. Yes. She sat on the stool. The question is whether this is a warning to stop or a warning that they're going to try to interfere with what I've already set in motion. The second one. He said it immediately. If they thought they could stop you, they'd try to stop you. They're telling you they know what you found, so you'll be uncertain about what they can do about it. Psychological pressure. They used it on Weller for a year. The fence, the missing pages, the small things that added up to a constant reminder that they were watching. She looked at the card in her hand. I need to go see Weller today. Make sure he knows this has escalated. I'll come with you. She looked at him. You have work. I always have work. He was already setting down the piece he'd been at. This is more important. She watched him for a moment, the simple, direct way he said it, without any of the performance that should have accompanied a declaration like that, just a fact being stated about a priority. It was one of the things she'd noticed about him from the beginning, the way he made his choices without dressing them up. All right, she said. Thank you. They walked to Weller's together, side by side on the frost-hardened road, and she thought that in the city, a woman of her position walking with a blacksmith would have produced commentary. Here it produced only nods from the people they passed, because in Redstone Crossing, Gideon Hale was known, and known well, and that knowledge apparently covered the people he chose to walk beside. Weller was shaken by the card, but steadied by the knowledge that the letters were already sent, that the state attorney's office would have received her communication 2 days ago, that the process was past the point where a warning card could stop it. His hand trembled slightly when he poured coffee for them and then steadied. She noticed him notice it and be irritated by it, the physical manifestation of fear that he was clearly trying not to feel. I'm not going to run, he said, before anyone asked him. I know, Vivian said. I've been running from this in one way or another for 2 years. He set the coffee pot down firmly. I'm done with it. Gideon looked at him across the table. Your fence line, the eastern section where it's been pushed. I can come out this week and document it, measure and record where it was and where it is now. That's evidence for a separate complaint if you want to use it. Weller looked at him. You'd do that. I've got iron for the fence post too if you want to put it back where it was. Harder to move iron. For a moment, something went through the old man's face that was too much to look at directly. It was the face of a person who had been worn down by a long, grinding thing and has just been offered something solid to hold on to. He pressed his lips together and nodded. "I'd appreciate that," he said. They stayed for an hour. Walking back, the morning had gone from gray to that particular flat winter white that meant cold without drama. The sky a uniform ceiling over the scrubland and the town. Vivian was quiet, thinking, and Gideon let her be quiet, which was another thing she'd noticed, that he didn't fill silence with words to manage it the way most people did. "The bridge," she said finally. He looked at her. "On the eastern road. The rail equipment has to come through there when the spur is built. I've been looking at the engineering survey, and the bridge is rated for standard wagon loads, but not for the freight weights a rail construction operation would use." She'd been worrying about this separate from everything else. "It's going to need reinforcement before we can move heavy equipment." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been looking at that bridge for 2 years, he said. She glanced at him. "What do you mean?" "The central support structure. There's a crack in the iron bracket that pins the main beam. It's been getting worse since spring. I told the county commission about it in April. They said it was within acceptable parameters." He said it flatly. "I looked at those parameters. They're wrong." She stopped walking. "It's going to fail. Not tomorrow, but under a serious load." He stopped too. "Yes." They looked at each other. She thought about freight wagons, about the rail construction timeline, about the fact that the county commission that had dismissed a safety concern about a bridge was the same commission that had been quietly reclassifying land for a decade. "Who else knows about the bracket?" she said. "Me, now you, the commissioner I told in April who didn't act on it." He paused. "If someone with heavy freight went over that bridge before it was repaired, I need to send another letter to San Antonio," she said, "about the bridge specifically. I can write down exactly what I told the commission and when, dated, in case it matters later. It will matter." She started walking again. He fell back into step beside her. "I want you to look at the bridge this week. Tell me what it would take to fix it." "I've already priced it out," he said. She turned to look at him. "In April, when I reported it, I wrote up what would be needed in case the commission wanted to act on it." He looked straight ahead. "They didn't, but I kept the notes." She stared at the road in front of her and thought about a man who reported a dangerous bridge to people who ignored him, kept his notes anyway, went back to his shop and kept working. Not out of strategy. Not because he was building toward something, just because it was the right thing to have done, so he'd done it. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You usually just ask. Why did you stay? In this county, under this commission. A man with your skills could go anywhere." He was quiet for 3 or 4 steps. "Because the people here need what I make," he said finally. "Mrs. Calloway needs her harrow fixed. Weller needs his fence posts. The Hendersons need their equipment through the winter." He glanced at her. "If I leave, who does that?" "Someone else might come." "Might." He shrugged, the one shoulder motion she'd come to know. "But they're here now, and I'm here now, and that's what I can do something about." She thought about that for the rest of the walk, and she was still thinking about it when they got back to the main street, and he turned toward the shop, and she turned toward the hotel, and he said good afternoon, and she said good afternoon, and they went their separate ways, which was the right thing to do, which she knew was the right thing to do, and which felt, in a way she was not going to examine too carefully right now, like exactly the wrong thing. She was in her room that evening writing the bridge letter to San Antonio when Holt knocked. "Mr. Colton Briggs is downstairs," he said. "He says it's important." She put down her pen. "Tell him I'll be down in 10 minutes." She took 15, not to make him wait, but because she needed to finish the paragraph she'd been writing, and she was not going to leave it half done. He was standing in the lobby, and whatever ease he'd carried for the past 2 weeks was gone. He looked like someone who'd had several difficult conversations in a short period and had come to have one more. "My father knows about the state attorney letter," he said, without preamble. "I thought he might." He stopped, chose his next words. "He's not going to accept this quietly." "I didn't think he would." Colton looked at her for a moment with something raw in his face. "I came here to tell you to be careful, not as a warning on his behalf, as—" He stopped again. I'm having a difficult time right now figuring out what I am. She looked at him. I know. He's my father. I know that too. And what he did is, he pressed his lips together. I don't have a word for what it is, in terms of what it means that I've been living on the results of it. She said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would make that easier, and she was done pretending there was. One day a cowboy will win your heart, he said, and it came out half like a joke and half like something else. A man trying to use lightness to carry more weight than lightness was built for. She looked at him. She thought about what she should say, the careful, diplomatic version that left room and didn't close doors. But she was tired of careful when directness was what the moment actually needed. I'd rather it be a blacksmith, she said. She hadn't planned it. It came out the way true things sometimes did when you stopped managing them. Colton looked at her. Something moved through his expression. Surprise first, then understanding, then something that was not quite hurt but was adjacent to it. A recognition of something he'd suspected but not confirmed. And then, slowly, something she hadn't expected. A kind of respect, clean and unperformed. The look of a man who has just learned something he didn't know and has decided to take it honestly. Hail, he said. She didn't answer. He nodded, slowly. He's a good man, he said, and it cost him something to say it, and he said it anyway. Better than most people here know. I know, she said. He put his hat on. Be careful, he said again, meaning it this time in a way that had nothing to do with his father's interests. The bridge on the Eastern Road. My father knows Gideon reported it in April. I heard him mention it last night. I don't know what he was meaning to do with that information, but he stopped. Just be careful. He left, and she stood in the lobby for a moment, and then she went upstairs and finished the bridge letter with a detail she hadn't put in before. The fact that the commission had been told about the structural problem and had failed to act, with the specific date and the name of the commissioner who'd received the report. Then she put on her coat and walked to the blacksmith's shop because he needed to know what Colton had just told her about Harlan Briggs and the bridge report, and because it was late and the shop would be dark and she might have to knock 3 times, and she was going to go anyway. The light was on. She knocked once. He opened the door and looked at her in the cold dark and read something in her face. Come in, he said. Tell me. She came in. The forge was low, burning down for the night, but the warmth of it was still in the room, and she sat on the stool for what felt like the 100th time and told him everything, and he listened, and the night outside the shop was cold and still, and somewhere 2 blocks north, in the best house in Redstone Crossing, a man was making calculations about what he still had time to do. He had his notes on the bridge in a box under the workbench, which was where he kept the things that mattered enough to save, but not enough to put anywhere better. He found them in under a minute. 2 folded pages in his own handwriting, dated April 14th, describing the crack in the iron bracket, the rate of progression he'd observed over 3 visits, the estimated load threshold below which it was safe and above which it wasn't, the name of the commissioner he'd told, the date of that conversation. Vivian read them twice without saying anything. Then she looked up. This is exactly what I needed, she said. It's just what I saw. Written down, dated, with a specific name and a specific date. She set the pages on the bench between them. Gideon. This is evidence that the county commission was warned about a structural safety issue and failed to act. On top of everything else, it's a separate problem from the land fraud, he said. It's the same problem. It's the same commission making the same calculation, that things can be ignored or buried when ignoring or burying them serves their interests. She looked at the pages again. Can I take these? That's why I got them out. She folded them carefully and put them in her coat pocket with the precision of someone who understood the weight of paper. He watched her do it and thought about the April afternoon when he'd written those notes, sitting at this same bench after coming back from the bridge, irritated and frustrated in the specific way he got frustrated when he reported something real and got told it was fine. He'd written the notes because he wanted a record that he'd seen what he'd seen, not because he thought they'd amount to anything. He'd put them in the box and mostly not thought about them after that. That was the way most things in his life worked. You did the right thing because it was the right thing. And sometimes years later it turned out to matter, and usually it didn't, and you tried not to let the ratio bother you. Colton said his father knows you reported it, she said. She was looking at him carefully. I heard you the first time. I know. I'm saying it again because I want to know if you understand what that might mean. He looked at her. Harlan Briggs has been running a system in this county for 8 years by making sure the people who knew things either left, stayed quiet, or had accidents. He said it evenly. Yes. I understand what it might mean. The word accident sat between them in the warm air of the shop. You should stay somewhere else tonight, she said. I'm not going to do that. Gideon! This is my shop. He said it without heat. I'm not going to be pushed out of my own shop by the suggestion that someone might want me gone. If I do that, where does it stop? He picked up the notes she'd left copies of, the ones he'd made for himself, and put them back in the box. What I'm going to do is make sure the right people know exactly what I know and have copies of what I have, so that anything that happens to me makes things worse for Harlan Briggs instead of better. She was quiet for a moment. That's a reasonable strategy, she said finally. It's also cold comfort if something happens. Most reasonable strategies are. She looked at him across the bench, and he looked back at her, and neither of them looked away for longer than was comfortable, and he thought, not for the first time in the past 3 weeks, but more clearly than usual, that he was in significant trouble of a kind that had nothing to do with Harlan Briggs. She'd said I'd rather it be a blacksmith to Colton Briggs in the hotel lobby. Colton had told him this within an hour, not maliciously, in the particular tone of a man delivering information he thought the recipient deserved to have. Gideon had listened to it and said nothing, and then had gone back to his shop and stood at his forge for 40 minutes, doing work that didn't need doing, which was his version of not knowing what to do. He was still not entirely sure what to do. The problem was not that he doubted her. She was the least ambiguous person he'd ever met, and she said things with the plain directness of someone who didn't waste words. The problem was that he could not get his understanding of himself to accommodate the idea. He was the blacksmith. She was the Ashcroft heir. These were not flexible categories in his experience, and the fact that she seemed entirely unconcerned by them didn't make them less real. He was aware this was his problem, and not hers. He was also aware that being aware of that didn't solve it. Go back to the hotel, he said. Lock the door. If anything feels wrong, send Holt for Doc Reeves. Not for the commission, for Reeves. He'll know what to do. And you? I'll be here. He picked up the piece he'd set down when she arrived, the mill equipment repair that had been waiting, and the motion of picking it up was also a motion of ending the conversation about the other thing, and they both understood that. I'll be at Weller's at first light to start on the fence documentation. Come find me there if anything happens overnight. She stood. She put on her coat. She stood at the door for a moment with her hand on the frame, and he did not look up from the mill equipment. And she said good night, and he said good night, and she left. And he held the mill part in his hands and did not work on it for a while. Nothing happened overnight. He knew this because he didn't sleep much, and the street outside the shop was quiet. And by 5 a.m, he'd given up on sleep and started the forge, and was working on a set of chain links for a well system by the time the sky started to lighten. He was at Weller's by 7. The old man was already up and outside, standing at the fence line with his arms crossed and his breath making fog in the cold air, looking at the iron stakes that marked where the line had been pushed. You came, Weller said. Said I would. Gideon set down his bag of tools and crouched at the first stake. You have the original survey pins? In the barn, from when I filed the property claim in 57. Weller went and got them. Old iron markers, hand-stamped with the filing date. Exactly what Gideon needed to establish where the line should be. They spent 2 hours documenting it. Gideon measured the distance between where the Briggs fence currently sat and where the original survey markers indicated the line should be. 14 feet of encroachment on the southern section, 11 on the eastern corner. He wrote it all down in the same precise way he'd written the bridge notes, with measurements and dates and a description of the physical evidence. Weller witnessed it and signed the bottom of each page. I'm going to put the iron posts in on the actual line, Gideon said, before we leave today. I brought the posts. Weller looked at him. The Briggs hands check this section most mornings. I know. He'd thought about this. If anyone shows up while we're doing it, you let me do the talking. Don't argue, don't escalate, just stand there. What are you going to say? That I'm doing property line maintenance on your behalf, and that any concerns about the location of the line should be directed to the county surveyor's office, and I'll write down the name of anyone who tries to interfere for the record. Weller's mouth moved in that not-quite smile. You think they'll accept that? No, but I think it'll make them pause long enough to think about whether this is the right week to have a confrontation, given everything else that's in motion. He picked up the first iron post. And I think they probably know more about what's in motion than we'd like. They worked through the morning. No Briggs hands appeared. By noon, 14 iron posts were set in the ground along the actual property line, solid and unambiguous. The kind of thing that took real effort to move and left marks when it was moved. Gideon drove each one in with the satisfaction of a man doing work he understood well. The weight of the mallet right in his hands. The give of the frozen ground just enough to tell him when the post was set. Vivian appeared at noon with a basket containing bread and cold meat and coffee in a sealed jar that was still hot, which she'd clearly planned in advance, and which meant she'd known he'd be here through the morning. She didn't make anything of this. She just set the basket down and said there was enough for 3. Weller ate with the particular gratitude of a man who hadn't had someone bring him food since his wife died, and didn't say so, and they all pretended not to notice. The state attorney's office will have sent an acknowledgement by now, she said, while they ate. Gerald Fitch will have received my letter and will be moving on the documentation Cal brought. We should expect questions from Austin within the week. And Harlan Briggs will know that too, Gideon said. Yes. She looked at the new fence posts, which is why those need to be in the ground now. They are, she nodded. She looked at the line of iron posts running clean and definite across the property boundary, and he watched her face do something quiet and satisfied that she probably didn't know was visible. Good, she said. The freight wagon came through on a Tuesday. It was the Hartley supply run, a load of railroad survey equipment being brought out from Abilene for the preliminary site assessment that Vivian's company had commissioned once the corridor documentation was far enough along. It was heavier than a standard freight load by a significant margin, 40% over what the bridge was rated for under the original specifications. Gideon had been told about this on Monday. He'd spent Monday evening going back to the bridge, looking at the bracket in the late afternoon light, pressing his thumb against the crack, the way you pressed a wound to feel how serious it was. It had gotten worse since April. The cold had gotten into it and done what cold does to iron, expanded and contracted it in the overnight cycles until the crack had propagated further into the main bracket body. He'd stood on that bridge for 20 minutes calculating what a 40% overload crossing would do to that bracket, and had arrived at an answer he didn't like. He'd sent a note to Vivian that evening. She'd come to the shop. Tell the driver to wait, he said. I can have a temporary support structure in place in 6 hours. It won't fix the bridge, but it'll hold for one crossing. The survey team is scheduled to arrive Wednesday. If the equipment doesn't clear the bridge Tuesday, the schedule shifts by a week minimum. Then it shifts. She looked at him. He looked back. 6 hours, she said. If you help me? Something shifted in her expression. What can I do? Hold things, he said. Pass things. Stay out of the way when I say stay out of the way. Can you do that? Yes. They went to the bridge at 5 the next morning before light. He'd loaded what he needed on the borrowed wagon, the same one Pete Garner's cousin had returned on Wednesday, clean and with a note of thanks tucked under the seat. Chain, iron plates, the cross-beam supports he'd been fabricating since Monday night, the tools he'd need to get underneath the main structure. The bridge over the Redstone Creek was a timber and iron structure of modest ambitions, built in the county's early days when the heaviest thing that crossed it was a loaded grain wagon. It had been adequate for 20 years, and it had been developing its inadequacy quietly for the past 3. He'd noticed it the way he noticed most things. Not all at once, but incrementally, each visit adding one more piece of information until the full picture was unavoidable. He went under it. The water was low and cold, not deep, but cold enough that being in it would be a problem. He worked from the bank as much as possible, using the reach of the longest bar, getting into the water only twice and briefly each time. Vivian handed him things when he needed them without asking unnecessary questions. And when he said, "Get back," she got back without arguing, which was not something he took for granted in people. The temporary support structure was not elegant. It was a cross-beam assembly bolted to the two main piers that distributed the load laterally and took the stress off the cracked bracket during the crossing. He'd done something similar once before, on a mill in East Texas, and that one had held, which was the closest thing to a guarantee he could offer. By 10 o'clock, it was in place. He stood on the bank and looked at it for a long time, running the calculations again in his head, going back over each connection point. "Will it hold?" she asked. "For one crossing at the specified load, yes." He didn't look away from the structure. If the driver goes slow, steady pace, no stopping on the structure, no sudden loading shifts. "I'll tell him. Tell him exactly what I said. Not the summary, the exact words." She looked at him. "All right." He'd planned to go back to the shop at that point, get dry, start the actual repair work that the bridge needed. That was the plan until they heard the wagon. It was moving too fast. He could hear it before he could see it, the heavy rumble of a loaded wagon with a driver in a hurry. The particular sound of too much weight moving at a speed that didn't respect it. He turned toward the road and saw it coming over the low rise. 4 horses, the wagon piled with the survey crates, the driver with his hat down against the cold. "He didn't get the message," Vivian said, already moving. She ran toward the road, waving, and the driver saw her and started hauling back on the reins, and the horses began to slow, but they were already on the approach to the bridge, already on the timber planking at the near end. And the weight of the load and the forward momentum of 4 horses wasn't something that slowed quickly. Gideon moved before he'd fully thought about what he was doing. He went for the near wheel, the right front wheel, closest to the bank, the one that was going to pass directly over the weakest section of the bracket assembly. If the wheel hit that section at speed, with this load, the temporary support structure he'd built might hold or it might not. And the difference between those two outcomes was the water and the equipment and 2 horses trapped beneath something very heavy in very cold water. He grabbed the wheel spoke as it came toward him. A thing you did not do with a moving wagon, a thing that could take your arm off at the shoulder, which he was aware of and did anyway. And he didn't try to stop it, because stopping it was impossible, but he got enough resistance on it to pull the front of the wagon slightly right toward the bank, away from the weakest section. The wagon went over. The bracket cracked. He heard it, a sharp report like a rifle shot under the rumble of the crossing, and the bridge shuddered, and for 3 seconds that lasted considerably longer than 3 seconds, he did not know what was going to happen. Then the wagon was across. On the far bank, the driver hauling back on the reins with everything he had, the horses sliding and blowing, the crate still on the wagon and intact. Gideon was standing in the creek up to his knees, where the momentum of the wheel had carried him off the bank. The water was cold in the particular way that took about 4 seconds to register and then became the only thing you were aware of. He waded back to the bank and climbed up. Vivian was there. She grabbed his arm, both hands, pulling, and he got up the bank and stood on solid ground and looked back at the bridge, which was still standing but was now significantly more compromised than it had been an hour ago. The bracket had cracked further. Another load would finish it. "You're bleeding," she said. He looked at his hands. The wheel spoke had taken the skin off 3 knuckles on his right hand and the edge of his left palm, and somewhere in the scramble down the bank he'd cut the heel of his right hand on something he couldn't identify. All of it was bleeding in the enthusiastic way that cold made things bleed before the blood thickened. "It's fine," he said. "It's not fine." Her hands were still on his arm, both of them, and she was looking at his hands with an expression that he recognized after a moment as anger. Not at him, just the anger that came from watching something preventable happen anyway. "It's not fine, and you know it." "Nothing serious." He flexed his fingers to demonstrate. They all moved. "See? That is not reassuring." She was already pulling something from her coat pocket. A clean cloth, folded, the kind of thing a person who thought ahead carried on a construction project. She wrapped it around his right hand and held it with more pressure than was strictly necessary. "You pulled a wagon wheel." I redirected it slightly. "You are the most—" She stopped, pressed the cloth tighter. "You could have been killed." "I could have been." I wasn't. He looked at her hands holding his. The load is across. The equipment is intact. That's the outcome we needed. That is not... She stopped again. She was looking at his hand in hers, and something was happening in her face that she was trying to control and not entirely managing. That is not the only outcome I cared about. The driver appeared on the far bank, shouting something, an apology from the tone of it, something about not having gotten the message about the pace. Vivian called back to him that everything was all right and to stay with the wagon, and the authority in her voice was the kind of authority that came from somewhere past training, a reflexive command presence that she probably didn't know she had. She looked back at Gideon. "We're going to Doc Reeves," she said. "Vivian, we are going to Doc Reeves." He went to Doc Reeves. Mess. Reeves cleaned the cuts and said nothing except the occasional professional observation. "Deeper on this one than I'd like. Hold still," and wrapped both hands with the efficient speed of a man who'd been doing this for 30 years and had long since stopped being dramatic about wounds that weren't going to kill anyone. "The bridge needs to be closed," he said, while he worked. "I'll put that in writing if you need it." "Please," Vivian said. She was sitting in the corner of the clinic, her coat still damp from the creek bank, her arms crossed in a position that Reeves probably read as composure, and Gideon read as the effort it took to hold composure together. "Full closure notice," Reeves said. "Medical safety grounds. That supersedes commission authority for repairs." He glanced at Vivian. "Does that help your timeline?" "It helps with the liability question," she said. "If the bridge is under medical closure, any commission decision to reopen it without completing the repair is documented negligence." "Good." Reeves tied off the bandage on Gideon's left hand. "That's 2, by the way. 2 documented failures to act on reported safety issues by the same commission. Your Austin lawyers are going to enjoy that." "They're not going to enjoy it," Vivian said. "They're going to use it." Same result. He handed Gideon a small bottle of carbolic. "Change the dressings tonight and tomorrow morning. If anything looks red and hot past the first day, come back." "It'll be fine," Gideon said. "It will be fine if you do what I told you." Reeves looked at him over his glasses. "You pulled a wagon wheel with your bare hands, Hale. Accept some limitations for 48 hours. Gideon accepted this without further argument, which was how Reeves knew it was bothering him more than he was letting on. Outside the clinic, the afternoon had gone to the particular flat gray of winter mid-afternoon, 2 hours before dark, when all the color had flattened out of the world. They walked without talking for a block, and then Vivian said, "I need to tell you something." "All right." "Gerald Fitch sent a telegraph this morning. I got it before we went to the bridge." She pulled a folded paper from her inner coat pocket and held it out. He took it with his less bandaged hand and read it. Fitch's message was precise and clipped, the way telegraph messages had to be. "State Attorney Office acknowledges receipt. Stop formal review initiated. Stop our cop. Investigator. Dispatched from Austin. Stop. Estimated arrival. 7 to 10 days. Stop. Advise principals maintain current positions. Stop." He read it twice. "It's real," he said. "It's real." She took the telegraph back. "An investigator from Austin, in 7 to 10 days. She folded it carefully. "Which means Harlan Briggs has 7 to 10 days to do whatever he's going to do." He thought about this. "Who knows the investigator is coming?" "Anyone who bribed the right telegraph operator." She said it without bitterness, just as information. "So possibly everyone. Then we need to talk to Weller tonight. I'll send Holt. Go yourself." He looked at her. "He needs to see you, not a note. He needs to know the person who started this is still standing here." She held his gaze. "I know." She paused. "Come with me." "Give me an hour. I need to go back to the shop and check the forge and change the dressing on this." He held up his right hand briefly. "I'll meet you at Weller's at 6. She nodded. Then she did something he hadn't expected. She put her hand on his arm, briefly, just a moment of contact, and took it back. "Thank you," she said. "For this morning, for the bridge. It was necessary. I know it was necessary." I'm thanking you anyway. She looked at him steadily. You could have been hurt badly. But I wasn't. You keep saying that. Because it's true. It's not the point. She held his gaze. The point is that you didn't hesitate. You just went. She seemed to be searching for something more precise than what she had. I've met a lot of men in my life who talk about what they'd do in a dangerous situation. You didn't talk, you just... It was a wagon, he said. I know wagons. She almost smiled. Yes, she said. You know wagons. She walked away. He stood on the clinic step and watched her go and thought about the cloth she'd wrapped around his hand, which was still there under Reeves's bandage, pressed against the cuts by the careful pressure of her hands. And he thought about a lot of things he wasn't going to say yet, for reasons he was going to have to examine soon. At Weller's that evening, they sat around the table again. The three of them, without Cal this time. Just the old man and Vivian read Fitch's telegraph aloud, and Weller sat with it for a moment. 7 to 10 days, he said. Yes? And Briggs knows. Probably. Weller looked at his hands on the table. Work hands, marked by decades of farming, the hands of a man who'd built something real out of real effort and had spent 2 years watching it get nibbled at by a system he couldn't fight alone. What does he do now? He said. If it were you, what do you do in the next 10 days when you know an investigator's coming? Vivian and Gideon looked at each other. You destroy what you can destroy, Gideon said, and you create counter-evidence for what you can't. The commission minutes that are missing, Weller said. He might try to produce a version of them, Vivian said carefully, a version that supports his account. It wouldn't hold against Cal's copies, but it might create enough confusion to slow the investigation. Can he do that? He controls the county records office, she said. He's done it before. She paused. Which is why this conversation we're having right now needs to be written down. Tonight, you, me, Gideon, statements about what we know and when we knew it, signed and dated. And then what? Then Gideon takes copies to his shop, and I take copies to the hotel, and you keep the originals in the safest place you have. She looked at him. Where's the safest place you have? Weller thought. The deed box, he said. In the floor under the kitchen. Been there since I built this house. Good. She had paper with her, which she'd brought, which meant she'd been planning this since the telegraph. Of course she had. Let's start. They wrote for 2 hours. Each of them made a statement. Weller about the commission vote and the fence line and the fire. Gideon about the bridge report and the April conversation and what he'd observed this morning. Vivian about the documents and the timeline and the anonymous card and everything Colton had told her. Each statement was signed. Each was dated. Gideon copied each one twice in his careful, legible hand, the same hand that wrote forged specifications and repair notes and bridge assessments. When it was done, Weller rolled the originals and put them in the deed box himself, in the floor under the kitchen table, and put the kitchen table back over it. And the three of them sat and drank the coffee that had gone cold while they were writing, and nobody talked for a while. I'd like to say I'm not scared, Weller said finally. You'd be stupid not to be scared, Gideon said. Weller laughed, a small, surprised sound. That's not what people usually say. I know. You're not scared? Gideon thought about it honestly. I'm something, he said. I don't know if scared is the right word. I'm alert. He turned the coffee cup in his bandaged hands. There's a lot at stake, and I know it, and I'm paying attention in the way you pay attention when things are at stake. That's probably what scared looks like from the inside when you're too busy to notice it. Weller looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at Vivian. He always like this? Yes, she said, and something in the way she said it made both men look at her, and she looked back at them without changing her expression at all, which was in itself a kind of expression. They walked back through the dark town together. The cold settled in fully now, the kind of night where the sky was very clear and very far away, and the sound of their boots on the frozen ground was the only sound. Colton came to see me again today, she said, while you were at the bridge. He hadn't known that. What did he want? He said his father had convened an emergency meeting of the commission this afternoon. He doesn't know what was decided. He said, she paused. He said his father asked him directly whether he'd had any conversations with me about the reclassification. He said he told him no. Gideon was quiet for a moment. He lied to his father for you. He lied to his father for himself, she said, or for the version of himself he's trying to figure out if he wants to be. She walked a few steps. He asked me something strange. He asked if I thought a person could be responsible for what they benefited from without knowing it. What did you say? I said I thought knowing changes the responsibility, but it doesn't eliminate the starting one. She looked at the street ahead of them. He thought about that for a long time, and then he said he had some thinking to do and left. Gideon thought about this. He's not going to help his father. No, I don't think he is. She paused. I don't think he'll actively work against him either, but he'll stand aside. She looked at Gideon sideways. He said something else. He said to tell you that there are 6 crates of survey equipment sitting on the wrong side of a broken bridge, and that the driver is camped out there overnight, and that if there's a way to get a repair started on the bridge faster than the commission is likely to authorize one, you might have a reason to start it tonight. Gideon stopped walking. She stopped too and looked at him. Colton said that, he said. He did. She held his gaze. He said, and I'm going to quote him exactly, that there's a man who knows that bridge better than anyone in the county, and that sometimes the right repair gets done before the paperwork catches up with it. He stood in the dark street and thought about Colton Briggs, who he'd known all his life, who was a complicated inheritance of good and bad and willing blindness, and who had apparently found some line he was still capable of standing on when it mattered. I'm going to need to go back to the shop, Gideon said. I thought you might. She reached into her pocket and produced something. The folded cloth she'd wrapped his hand in that morning. Cleaned now, folded clean. For the dressings, she said. Reeves said change them tonight. He took it. You went back to the hotel and washed this. It's a cloth. She said it the way he said things about wagons and lanterns. Just a fact, just the obvious thing. He looked at her in the dark and she looked back. And the cold was very cold and the town was very quiet. And he thought about all the things he hadn't said and whether the reasons he hadn't said them were as solid as he'd thought they were. And he arrived at the conclusion, as he sometimes arrived at conclusions in the forge, not all at once, but as a weight accumulating until the answer became the only answer, that they probably weren't. Thank you, he said, for this morning, for the statements, for Weller. You said it was necessary. It was. I'm thanking you anyway. He said it back to her, her own words, and watched her face register it. She didn't smile, not quite, but something in her expression settled, the way metal settled when you got the temperature right. Go fix the bridge, she said. He went. He worked through most of the night, and it was cold and uncomfortable, and the temporary repair was not the permanent repair the bridge needed. But it was solid, and by 3 a.m, the bracket assembly was stabilized and cross-braced in a way that would hold the survey equipment across safely in the morning. And when the driver woke at dawn and saw what had been done, he stood at the bank for a long time looking at it, and then he took his load across slow and steady, one wheel at a time, and the bridge held. Gideon was already back at the shop by then, restarting the forge, his hands aching in the cold through the bandages, his back aching from the creek bank work, and he was tired in the particular satisfying way of someone who'd done something difficult and real and was still standing at the end of it. He thought about Vivian's hands on his in the cold morning by the creek, pressing the cloth against the cuts. He thought about what she'd said to Colton, which Colton had told him. He thought about all the reasons he'd been carrying around for why this was impossible, and he laid them out in his mind the way he laid out broken pieces of equipment, evaluating each one for whether it was actually structural or just the habit of believing it was. And he found, in the gray morning light of the forge, that most of them were the second thing. He was going to have to do something about that. Not today. Today there were bandages to change and iron to work, and an investigator coming from Austin in 7 to 10 days, and a county commission that was holding an emergency meeting whose outcome he didn't know yet. But soon. He picked up the hammer. The forge was coming up to temperature. Outside, the sun was just beginning to make the idea of itself known in the eastern sky, and Redstone Crossing was waking up around him, and he started to work. The investigator from Austin arrived on a Thursday, 8 days after Gerald Fitch's telegraph, which meant he'd moved faster than the estimate, which meant someone in the state attorney's office had decided this was worth moving fast on. His name was Garfield Pruitt. He was a compact, gray-haired man in his late 50s who wore a suit that had seen considerable travel and carried a leather case that had seen more. He arrived on the morning stage and went directly to the hotel, and by noon the word had moved through Redstone Crossing the way words moved through small towns. Not announced, but somehow universally known, so that by the time Vivian received his formal card at 2 o'clock that afternoon, she already knew he'd also sent cards to Weller, to Doc Reeves, and to the county commission office. She met him in the hotel parlor. He had the manner of a man who had sat across from a great many people who were either hiding something or afraid of something and had developed the patience to wait out both. "Miss Ashcroft," he said, "your documentation is thorough." "Thank you." That wasn't a compliment so much as an observation. He set his case on the table between them. Thorough documentation sometimes indicates a prepared narrative rather than a discovered truth. I want you to understand that I'm going to test everything. "I'd be disappointed if you didn't," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then something in his face settled slightly. "Good, let's begin." They went for 3 hours. He asked questions she'd expected and questions she hadn't, and he circled back on things she'd already answered to see if the answer changed, which it didn't, and at the end of it he had 6 additional pages of notes to go with whatever he'd already had from her documents in Fitch's filing. "The blacksmith," he said, near the end. "Gideon Hale. He provided the bridge assessment and the original report documentation." "Yes." "He also physically reinforced the bridge 2 nights ago without county authorization." "The bridge was under medical closure order," she said. "Doc Reeves issued it. There's no prohibition on private repair work under a medical closure. The closure applies to traffic, not to safety maintenance." Pruitt wrote something down. Convenient interpretation. Accurate interpretation. She held his gaze. "If you'd like to debate it, I can have my lawyers produce the relevant county charter provisions." He almost smiled. "That won't be necessary." He closed his notebook. "I'll need to speak with Mr. Hale directly. He'll be at his shop." "I assumed as much." Gideon saw Pruitt coming from the shop window, the purposeful walk of someone who knew where he was going and why, and put down the work he was at and waited. He'd known this conversation was coming. He'd thought about what he was going to say, which was the same thing he always said in any conversation. What he knew, how he knew it, when. Pruitt came in and looked around the shop with the particular evaluation of a man who read environments. Then he looked at Gideon. "You reported the bridge bracket in April," he said. "April 14th. Commissioner Dugan, in his office at 10 in the morning. You have notes?" "I have notes." Pruitt sat on the stool, Vivian's stool, though Pruitt didn't know that, and opened his notebook. "Tell me exactly what happened." Gideon told him. He told him about April and about every visit to the bridge since, and about the Tuesday morning and the freight wagon and his hands, which were still bandaged in a way that Pruitt could see, and about the night repair and why he'd done it, and what he'd done and what condition the bracket was in now. He told it the same way he'd written his bridge notes, in the order things happened, with specific details, and no interpretation beyond what the facts supported. Pruitt wrote steadily. At the end he looked at his notes, then at Gideon. "You're not a lawyer or an engineer. Why should I weight your structural assessment against the Commission's position that the bridge was within acceptable parameters? Because I've been working iron for 12 years, and I know what a crack in a load-bearing bracket means." He held the investigator's gaze. "And because the freight wagon crossed that bridge on Tuesday, and the bracket cracked further under the load, which is what I said would happen if a heavy load crossed it, which I said in April, which is documented." He paused. "You can also speak to the driver. He heard the crack." Pruitt looked at him for another moment. "The driver. Do you have his name?" "Pete Garner's cousin from Sweetwater. His name is Roy Garner. He's probably still in the county. The survey equipment is on the far side of a bridge he'd be reluctant to recross without a repair certification." Pruitt wrote this down. "You think of everything." "I try to think of what's relevant," Gideon said. which isn't the same thing. The investigator left an hour later, and Gideon went back to his work, and the afternoon moved on. Harlan Briggs made his move on Friday. It came through the commission, an emergency resolution, passed 4-1 in a session that hadn't been publicly noticed as required by county charter, reclassifying 3 of the 16 parcels back to transit corridor designation while simultaneously filing a countercomplaint with the state land office disputing the authority of the state attorney to review county commission decisions without gubernatorial authorization. It was, Vivian's lawyer told her by telegraph Friday evening, a delay tactic. Probably not a successful one, but it would muddy the timeline and give Harlan's allies in other county offices time to align their stories. She went to the shop that evening not because she had news that couldn't wait, but because she needed to think, and the shop was where she thought, which was a thing she'd stopped pretending was about anything practical. Gideon was working on the permanent bridge repair designs. She could see them spread on the bench, careful drawings in pencil showing the new bracket geometry, the specifications for the iron he'd need. He'd started on them without being asked. He'd probably started on them the day after the Tuesday crossing. She told him about the commission resolution. He listened without surprise. Counter-complaint to dispute jurisdiction, he said. That takes 2 to 3 months to resolve through the state process. Yes. And in 2 to 3 months, the land transactions are harder to unwind, and the principals have more time to move assets. She sat on the stool. Pruitt knows this. He was already in the commission records office today. I saw him going in. He's trying to get everything he can before Harlan has time to prepare counter documentation. Will he get it? Cal's copies are clean and dated. The originals Harlan has access to. Some of them are already compromised, the missing pages from the February minutes. What he can produce now will be compared against what Cal has, and the discrepancies will themselves be evidence. She looked at the bridge drawings. This is a good design. It's what the bridge should have been built with in the first place. He didn't look up. The original design underspecs the main bracket by about 30% for the loads this road actually carries. Someone cut costs somewhere. Can you build it? I need to order iron. The main bracket piece is larger than anything I've made here. He finally looked up. I'd need to go to Abilene for the stock. 4 days, maybe 5. Then go. He looked at her. You'll be all right here. It wasn't quite a question. She understood what he was actually asking. Pruitt is here, she said. Weller and Reeves are both on record. The documents are in 3 separate locations. She met his gaze steadily. I'll be all right. He nodded. I'll leave Monday. Saturday came, and Vivian spent the morning with Pruitt going over the timeline of the parcel transactions one more time, and the afternoon writing to her San Antonio lawyers about the jurisdictional countercomplaint, and the evening doing nothing in particular, which she was bad at. She was still doing nothing in particular when a knock came at her hotel room door at 7 o'clock. She opened it expecting Holt and found Gideon, hat in hand, in a clean shirt that was not his work shirt, which she noticed. There's a gathering tonight, he said, at the Morrison place. Oh, families, some music, the kind of thing I usually don't attend. He held her gaze. I thought I might this time. She looked at him for a moment. Give me 10 minutes, she said. I'll wait downstairs. She changed her dress, which she hadn't planned to do and did anyway, and they walked to the Morrison place together through the cold December dark, side by side the way they always walked, at the same pace. The gathering was exactly what small-town gatherings were, crowded and warm and loud with the particular noise of people who lived close enough to each other to have developed the specific shorthand of long acquaintance. Someone was playing a fiddle. There were children underfoot. The tables had food on them that had been cooked with the serious intention that people brought to feeding their neighbors. Gideon moved through it differently than Colton had moved through the hotel dinner. He didn't work the room. He just existed in it, and people found their way to him. A word here, a question about a repair, a hand on the shoulder from Jim Henderson, who was back on his feet and moving carefully, who gripped Gideon's arm and said something low that Vivian couldn't hear, and which made Gideon shake his head once, dismissing whatever it was, the gesture of a man deflecting thanks. She watched this and thought about what Mrs. Calloway had told her, weeks ago, that he'd built a whole life out of nothing, one piece at a time. She could see the life from here. It wasn't the kind of life that made a large noise. But it was real in the way that things were real when they'd been built by hand, with the honest material of daily choices, each one small and most of them unwitnessed. He found her at the edge of the room an hour in. "You're thinking," he said. "I usually am." "You're thinking something specific." She looked at him. "I was thinking about what it costs to build a life the way you've built yours. The daily cost of it. Doing the right thing when no one's going to notice, doing it anyway, doing it again." He was quiet for a moment. "It doesn't feel like cost when you're doing it. It just feels like the work." "That's what I mean." She held his gaze. "Most people calculate the cost before they act. You just act." "Most people are smarter about their energy than I am. That's not what it is, and you know it." She said it simply. Not as a challenge, just a fact. He looked at her for a long time in the warm, crowded room. The fiddle was playing something she didn't know, and the sound of it moved around them, and she thought that there were things between them that had been waiting to be said for weeks, and that they were both standing at the edge of saying them. "Vivienne," he said. Just her name, the way he'd started saying it recently, without the formality that had fallen away somewhere in the middle of a sleepless night on a creek bank. "I know," she said. "I haven't said anything yet." "I know what you're going to say." He almost smiled. "Then you know I've been an idiot about it." "I know you've been careful about it," she said. "Which I understand. I'm careful about things too." She looked at him. "But there are things worth being less careful about." He was quiet for a moment, and she watched him work through something. Not hesitation exactly, more the last clearing of an old obstruction, the kind of clearing that didn't happen all at once but had been happening for weeks. "I decided something in my shop at 3 a.m. a few days ago," he said. "Going over the reasons I'd been telling myself that this," he made a small gesture between them, "wasn't possible. And I found that most of them were just habits, old ideas about categories, who belongs where." He looked at her directly. "I don't actually believe those things. I just got used to thinking them." "What do you believe?" she said. "I believe—" He stopped, reconsidered. Not the thought, but the precision of it. The way he reconsidered the angle on a difficult piece of work before the final strike. "I believe that the best thing I know how to do is make things that hold, things that don't fail under load." He met her eyes. "And I think you are the most substantial person I've ever met, and I would very much like, to know you for a long time." It was not a declaration shaped from a template. It was the particular and considered words of a man who had thought about exactly what he meant, and said exactly that. She had waited her entire life, she realized, not for someone to say something beautiful, but for someone to say something true. "I intend to be in Redstone Crossing for some time," she said. "The rail spur, the legal process, the bridge." She paused. "Possibly longer than those things require." "Is that so?" "I seem to find the company worthwhile." The fiddle shifted to something slower, and somewhere across the room Mrs. Calloway caught Vivian's eye and looked quickly away with an expression of complete innocence that indicated she had seen exactly what was happening and had probably known it was going to happen longer than either of them had. But Harlan Briggs's jurisdictional countercomplaint was dismissed by the state land office 11 days later, on a Thursday, on the grounds that fraud allegations involving documented destruction of official county records fell squarely within state attorney authority, regardless of the origin of the commission decision being reviewed. Pruitt had spent those 11 days doing what he did, and he'd done it well. He had Roy Garner's account of the Tuesday crossing. He had Doc Reeves's signed statement about Alderman's 1884 misrepresentation. He had Commissioner Weller's full testimony about the February vote and the fire and the missing pages. He had Gideon's bridge notes from April, dated and witnessed. He had Cal Weller's complete document set. He had Vivian's transaction analysis covering 8 years and 16 parcels. He had 3 other former county residents located through public record searches who had lost property in earlier transactions and were now, for the first time, being asked what they knew. When the counter-complaint was dismissed, Harlan Briggs called an emergency commission session that lasted 4 hours and apparently involved significant shouting, based on what Fletcher Morris reported afterward, who had stood outside the building for most of it on the pretense of checking his horse. Commissioner Dugan resigned the following day. Commissioner Farley 2 days after that. Hewitt held on for another week before submitting his resignation in a letter that expressed deep personal regret and a desire to spend more time with his family, which was the standard language for people exiting positions they'd held corruptly and didn't want to talk about directly. Harlan Briggs did not resign. He retained 2 lawyers from San Antonio and issued a public statement through the county paper denying all allegations and characterizing the investigation as a politically motivated attack on local governance by outside railroad interests. The statement was printed on page 3. On page 1 was Pruitt's formal announcement that criminal charges were being recommended to the state attorney's office relating to fraudulent modification of public records and conspiracy to defraud. The county paper had not had a page 1 story that significant since a cattle stampede in 1881. Gideon read the paper in his shop on a Tuesday morning, and then he set it down and went back to work, because the work was what it had always been, regardless of what was in the papers. Vivian read it in the hotel and then wrote 4 letters, to Pruitt, to Fitch, to her San Antonio lawyers, and to the railroad company's engineering division, authorizing the formal commencement of the rail spur survey. That last letter was the one she'd been waiting to write since she'd arrived in Redstone Crossing 6 weeks ago, and she wrote it without ceremony, without marking the moment with anything except the scratch of the pen and the fold of the paper, because the moment was its own marker and didn't need help. Colton Briggs came to the hotel the week after the paper ran. He looked tired in a way that was bone deep, the tiredness of someone who had been doing the internal work of revising their understanding of their own life, which was the hardest kind of work there was. My father's lawyers think he'll accept a civil settlement rather than face criminal charges, he said. The restitution would go to the affected property owners. That's appropriate, Vivian said. Some of the land, the parcels we've held longest, I'm going to deed them back, not all of it, but the ones where the original transaction was clearly... He stopped. The ones where I know what happened. She looked at him. You don't have to do that. I know. He met her eyes. I'm doing it because I know, and knowing changes the obligation. That's what you said. He paused. You were right. She thought about what Gideon had said weeks ago, that Colton had grown into the shape of his family, like water poured into a vessel. She thought that water, given a different vessel, took a different shape. It was still water, but the shape was different. Weller's fence line, she said. I'll have it restored to the original survey markers this week. He looked at the table. He deserves that. He deserved it 2 years ago. He does. He stood. He held out his hand and she shook it, and it was the handshake of 2 people at the end of something, or the beginning of a different kind of something, not uncomplicated. Gideon, he said. Yes? Tell him... He stopped, reconsidered. Actually, don't tell him anything from me. He doesn't need me telling him things through other people. He put on his hat. He never did. He left, and the room felt both larger and quieter, and Vivian sat for a while with the morning light coming through the hotel window and thought about what it meant that the man who'd started all this as a rival had ended it by being, in his way, decent. People were not just their worst associations. She was starting to believe this in a way she hadn't when Gideon first said it. The bridge repair took 2 weeks. Gideon ordered the iron from Abilene, and it came in on a Wednesday, and he started fabricating the new bracket assembly that same afternoon. He worked on it at the shop, and then transported the finished pieces to the bridge and worked there in the cold, sometimes with help he recruited from Jim Henderson, who was well enough now to assist but not well enough for heavy lifting, and once with Vivian, who held the lantern, the repaired lantern, her lantern, while he made the final adjustments to the bracket mounting in the last hour before dark. Steady, he said. I'm steady, she said. Little higher. She raised the lantern. The light fell across the bracket, and the new iron gleamed where the old iron had cracked, solid and correctly specified and made to actually hold what was going to cross it. Good, he said. That's it. He made the last bolts fast and climbed down and stood back and looked at the bridge the way he always looked at finished work, with the evaluating eye of someone who could see every place where his own judgment had been tested, every decision point, every place where it could have gone wrong. It's right, he said. Not proud exactly, just certain. Yes, she said. She was looking at him rather than the bridge. It is. He looked at her then, and the lantern was between them, throwing its steady repaired light, and he thought about the first day she'd walked into his shop with a broken thing and asked if he could fix it, and about all the things that had happened since, and about how little he'd understood then about what was actually beginning. Come back to the shop, he said. I'll make coffee. You always make coffee at the worst moments. I make coffee at moments that need it, he corrected. That's different. She walked with him back to the shop in the cold dark, and he built up the fire and made coffee, and they sat, she on the stool, he on the workbench, which was where he'd started sitting once the stool was reliably hers, and the shop was warm, and the coffee was hot, and outside the town was doing whatever towns did at 9 o'clock on a December night. Gerald Fitch sent a telegraph today, she said. About the investigation? About the rail spur. The engineering survey authorization went through. They want to start the ground survey in February. She held the coffee cup in both hands. He asked when I was coming back to Austin. Gideon looked at the coffee in his own cup. He didn't say anything. I told him I wasn't sure, she said. That I had things here that weren't finished. He looked up. The bridge is certified now, she said. The legal process is moving. The land fraud documentation is in Austin. I could leave and it would all continue without me. She held his gaze. That's not the same as saying there's nothing left here that I want to finish. What's left? He said. He said it quietly, not as a challenge, as a genuine question. I want to see the rail spur built, she said. I want to know that Weller's fence line is where it's supposed to be and that it stays there. I want to watch Mrs. Calloway's farm get through the winter. She paused. And I want to spend more time in this shop talking to you, which I realize is an unusual thing to say to a blacksmith, but I have stopped being embarrassed about it. He set his coffee cup down on the workbench. Vivian, he said, I know you're going to say something careful. I'm not, he said. I was going to say that I'm glad you're staying. She looked at him. That's all? That's the main thing. He looked at his hands. The bandages were gone now, the cuts healed, just the normal marks of the work remaining. The rest of it, what this is, what it becomes, I don't think it needs a speech. I think it needs time, which we'd have if you're staying. I'm staying. Then we have time. She nodded slowly. She looked at the shop around her, the tools on the walls, the forge's low glow, the drawings on the bench, the box under the workbench where he kept things that mattered, the gate he'd finished weeks ago that was now hanging in the Alderman garden because a man who didn't choose his customers by their politics had done beautiful work for a woman who made quilts for struggling families, regardless of what her husband did. She thought about what this town had taught her, which she hadn't expected to learn. She had come to Redstone Crossing with a specific kind of intelligence, the intelligence of capital and legal structures and strategic positioning, the intelligence that her father had built and she had inherited and spent years sharpening. That intelligence was real, and she didn't undervalue it. It had exposed Harlan Briggs. It had protected Weller's land. It had set in motion the things that were going to result, slowly and imperfectly and with the usual friction of any real process, in something like justice. But it was not the only kind of intelligence in the room. There was another kind, which she had watched operating for 6 weeks in a man who noticed a cracked bridge bracket in April and wrote it down because it was the true thing to do, who lent his wagon to a stranger because the stranger needed it and he had it, who put iron fence posts in frozen ground to mark a line that someone powerful had tried to erase, who grabbed a wagon wheel with his bare hands because the horses were going to be hurt, and the calculation of risk and response took less than a second, because he had spent his whole life building the kind of character that made the calculation automatic. She had spent years surrounded by successful men. She had met very few people whose strength came from the place his came from, not from what they'd accumulated or who they knew or what they could do to you if you crossed them, but from who they were when no one was watching, which turned out to be exactly who they were when everyone was watching. Because there was no difference. Because the inside and the outside were the same material. That was the rarest thing she knew of. She had stopped pretending she didn't know it. Tell me something, she said. What? When you stay somewhere, when you decide a place is yours and you stay in it and you build your life there, What does that feel like? He thought about it the way he thought about everything, honestly, without rushing to the convenient answer. Like the work, he said finally. You get up and you do what the day needs, and you go to sleep and you do it again. And at some point you look around and there's something there that wasn't there before. Something real. He looked at her. It's not dramatic, it's just accumulated. One day at a time until you have a life. She thought about this. I've never accumulated anything that way, she said. I've always been moving towards something. A goal, a deal, a resolution. One thing finished and then another. That's not a criticism. I know. I'm thinking about it. She looked at him. What would it look like, do you think, to stop moving towards something and start building something instead? Like this, he said simply. What we've been doing for the past 6 weeks. That's what building something looks like. It looks like showing up. It looks like hard conversations and cold creek banks and coffee at 9 o'clock at night. He paused. It doesn't look like anything dramatic. It just looks like time spent on purpose. She absorbed that for a long moment. I think, she said slowly, that I have been very well educated in the wrong direction for a very long time. No. He shook his head. The railroad knowledge and the legal strategy and the document analysis, that saved Weller's land. That started the process that's going to hold Harlan Briggs accountable. That's real. He looked at her. You just needed something to put it next to, something that worked differently. A forge and a set of iron fence posts. More or less. She looked at him and thought that he was perhaps the only person she'd ever met who could have said what he just said without it sounding like a lesson, because it wasn't a lesson from him. It was just observation, honest and unadorned, the way he said everything. The coffee had gone cold. Neither of them moved to address this. I'm going to invest in the rail spur construction, she said. Not just the corridor easement, the actual construction company. I want it built by a firm that will hire local labor, use local suppliers where possible. The metalwork for the rail infrastructure. That's a substantial contract. Yes. She held his gaze. Is your shop large enough? He looked at the shop around him, then at her. No. Would it be with an addition to the east side and an industrial forge? He was quiet for a moment. That's a significant commitment. I'm aware. Not just financially, you'd be... He stopped. Thought. You'd be here, in this town, connected to it in ways that are hard to undo. I know. And you want that. I want that. She said it without hesitation. I want to be connected to something in ways that are hard to undo. I have been unconnected from everything my entire life, Gideon. I have been so free that I had nothing. She said it plainly, without self-pity, just the honest accounting of a thing. I want the fence posts in the ground. I want the iron that stays. He looked at her for a long time. The forge settled, a small sound in the quiet, the fire doing what fire did, patient and constant. The east wall comes down easy enough, he said. The foundation on that side would need to go deeper for a second forge. He was looking at the east wall with the evaluating eye of a man already doing the calculations. 3 months to build it right. Maybe 4. I have time, she said. I'd need to see the rail construction specifications before I could quote the contract. The metallurgical requirements for rail infrastructure are specific. I'll have them sent from Austin. All right? He looked at her. Not at the wall anymore, at her. All right. That was all. No ceremony. No declaration shaped for an audience. Just 2 people in a warm shop on a cold night, agreeing on the specific terms of a future they were going to build one day at a time, and the fire in the forge keeping its own patient time. The rail spur survey began in February, as scheduled. By spring, the formal charges against Harlan Briggs had moved to a state court in Austin, where they would take 18 months to resolve in a manner that was complicated and imperfect and real, the way justice actually worked when it worked at all. 3 of the 16 affected parcels were returned to their original owners or their heirs. The rest became part of a civil settlement that paid restitution from the Briggs estate. It was not everything. It was something, which was usually the available choice. Commissioner Weller served out his term and was re-elected to a commission that now had 3 members who had not been there under Harlan Briggs, and the commission minutes were complete for the first time in 8 years. His fence line stood where it was supposed to stand, marked by 14 iron posts that had settled into the ground through a hard winter and were not going anywhere. Mrs. Calloway's farm made it through the winter. So did the Hendersons and the Morales well pump, and a dozen other things that Gideon kept running in the way he always had, without announcement. The east wall of the shop came down in March, on a clear, cold day when the air had the particular quality of something ending and something beginning at the same time, which was what early spring felt like in Texas. The uncertainty of it, the not-yetness. Gideon swung the first sledge himself, and the old timber came down in sections, and Vivian stood in the yard and watched and thought about walls, and what it meant when the right ones came down. The addition went up through April and May. An industrial forge was installed in June, the largest piece of metalworking equipment in this part of the county. The first rail construction contract came in July. Gideon read the metallurgical specifications with the same careful attention he brought to a cracked bracket on a bridge, and then he built what the specifications called for, and it held. On the day the first completed rail section was laid in the corridor east of Redstone Crossing, a day that was not dramatic, that looked like a group of working men with tools and heavy materials doing difficult physical labor in the afternoon heat, Vivian and Gideon stood at the edge of the site and watched it happen. She had her hand in his. She'd reached for it sometime in the past hour without marking the moment, and he'd taken it with the same matter-of-fact quality he brought to everything, and there it was. "Is it what you thought it would be?" he asked. He was looking at the rail section going down, the crew working with the specific efficiency of men who'd done this before. "Better," she said, "because it's real." He looked at her sideways. "Most things are better when they're real." You'd think that would be obvious. She looked at the rail, at the flat Texas distance beyond it, at the town behind them with its dry goods store and its clinic and its blacksmith shop with the new East Edition. It took me a long time to understand that beautiful things at a distance are worth less than plain things you can put your hands on. He was quiet for a moment. "Is that what I am?" he said. "A plain thing you can put your hands on." She looked at him. "You're the most substantial person I know," she said, "which is a better thing to be." He didn't answer that out loud, but he held her hand a little more firmly, and she held his, and the rail went down into the ground, and the afternoon moved on, and in the town behind them, the forge and the blacksmith shop was cooling down for the evening, its work done for the day, waiting for tomorrow. The people of Redstone Crossing had a way of telling the story later the story of the Ashcroft woman and the blacksmith. And different people told it differently, the way people always did. Some of them emphasized the legal case, the fraud exposure, the rail spur. Some of them talked about the bridge. Some of them, the ones who had been in the shop or at the gatherings or at Weller's table, told a quieter version about documents and fence posts and coffee gone cold in the middle of conversations that mattered. What they agreed on, the ones who'd been close enough to see it, was this. She had not chosen him despite what he was. She had chosen him because of it. Because of the box under the workbench where he kept things worth keeping. Because of the bridge notes dated April 14th that nobody had asked him to write, and he'd written anyway. Because of the stool that had slowly become hers, in a shop that had become a place where the most important conversations of that particular year had happened, in heat and plain honesty, between two people who said what they meant and meant what they said. Vivian Ashcroft had come to Redstone Crossing with a lantern that was broken, and a land survey that didn't add up, and a certain hard-working intelligence that was real but incomplete. She left, or didn't leave, which was the more accurate version, with all of those things resolved and one thing added that hadn't been in any of her plans. The lantern still worked. She kept it on the windowsill of the house they built together on the eastern edge of town. The house with the iron fittings on every door and the gate in the front yard that had a quality of living growth to its scrollwork, curves that looked like they'd grown rather than been hammered into shape. Every evening, when the light went, it came on automatically in the window, the repaired mechanism moving as it was supposed to move, the small, steady flame of a thing fixed right and trusted to hold. It held.